Tricky Paws by Curran Winters. Book 6 of the Kitten Witch series. For the ad-free version or to get the rest of the series, pick up the audiobook at Curran Winters' Cozy Mystery Bookstore by going to cutecozymystery.com. Be sure to use discount code CUTE40 to take 40% off. Chapter 1. Ember McNair, pub owner, witch, amateur sleuth, and bride-to-be, sat straight-backed and anxious in the lobby of the Fairy Tales Inn. Of all the inns in Cauchemar, Louisiana, the Fairy Tales Inn was the one best beloved for its charm and local color. It was where important and interesting people who passed through town tended to stay. At that moment, there was a very important and interesting person just upstairs. Ember was waiting for that person to come down and meet her in the lobby. The inn was run by Ember's friend Luca Reynolds, who was a sweet, charming fairy. At the moment, Luca was hovering nearby, lighting a cedar-scented candle on a side table. All the while, as she fussed around the room, Luca politely pretended not to know her friend Ember was squirming in quiet agony in the wingback chair not 5 paces away. "Coffee, hun?" Luca asked Ember sweetly when Ember's eyes flicked up to her for a second. Ember shook her head. No. We'll probably, head out to the pub, once she comes down." Luca nodded and gave Ember's shoulder a quick squeeze as she moved past. "That'll be nice," she remarked softly. "You'll get to show her your business. I'm sure she'll be really proud." Will she be proud? Ember couldn't help but wonder. Weeks ago, the thought that she even had a sister to be proud of her would have made Ember laugh in disbelief. Ember had lost all memories of her sister, Ash, due to some magical means Ember still didn't fully understand. It had taken a lot of time, effort, and risky work on the part of Ember and her friends to win her back her memories. Now she cherished those memories like the fragile things they were. Since she had brought them back with a powerful spell, Ember caught herself returning to them again and again, turning them over. Ash had always been the mischievous one. Ember recalled that now, following after her sister, watching her antics with wide-eyed delight. All the friends they've made together, the huddles of neighborhood kids with scraped knees roaming the local cul-de-sacs on bicycles and rollerblades. And Ash at the heart of it all, the bravest and boldest of them, their de facto leader, organizing charges through the woods. Since regaining her memories a few days ago, Ember and Ash had shared a few conversations on the phone. It filled Ember's heart full to brimming to get to speak again with the sister she'd lost. But it also made her feel a deep, pulling sorrow to talk to Ash. Talking to her reminded Ember of all the time they'd lost irretrievably, all the parts of Ash's life Ember didn't know anything about, and maybe never would. Not to mention all the parts of Ember's life Ash didn't know about yet. Speaking of which, Ember's phone buzzed with a message from her fiancé. "Hope you're holding up well," Cedric wrote. Then, seconds later, another message. "Thinking of you." Ember smiled at her phone screen. Without Cedric, she never would have found Ash. He had been the one to remind Ember of her sister's existence. Cedric had been one of those neighbor kids on bicycles way back in the day. That was how he'd known Ash. When he realized Ember and her family didn't have any memory of her, he'd started his dogged pursuit of answers. He'd been the one to track down Ash, who was using a different name, and help Ember and her sister reconnect. Of all the parts of her life Ember was eager to fill her sister in on, she was perhaps most excited to tell Ash all about her relationship with Cedric, and most particularly about the wedding, which was only a week away. Nearly all of the preparations for the wedding were done already. It wasn't going to be a huge affair. Neither bride nor groom was interested in throwing a big blowout. The reception would be held in Ember's own pub, and Cedric had been incredibly helpful, even taking on more than his fair share of the planning in order to give Ember time to adjust to bringing Ash back into her life. "You've got enough on your plate, I should think," he'd told her one evening, when he found her agonizing over the seating charts. Then he'd plucked them up from the table, and she hadn't had to think about it ever again. As far as Ember was concerned, she was marrying a superhero. Still in the lobby waiting, she tapped out. She should be down soon. Then we're headed to the Broken Broom. Then in another message she added "love you." Texting your beau? The voice was distinctly not Luca's. Ember looked up from her phone, eyes wide. The woman standing before her was in some ways familiar, and in some ways a complete stranger. With her dark hair and ultramarine eyes, she looked a good deal like Ember herself. And she looked even more like the girl Ember had adored all those years ago, had trailed after like a shadow. Ash, Ember said, rising hastily from the wingback chair. In her rush, her phone tumbled to the ground. Oh, she cried, dropping to pick it up. Oh no, let me get that. Ash was faster. They nearly bumped heads on the way down, so Ember awkwardly rose and waited, allowing her sister to fetch her phone for her. When Ash straightened up again, phone in hand, she was smirking faintly. Sorry, I didn't mean to see the screen, it just... Ember took the phone back, glancing at the screen to see what Ash had witnessed. Love You Too from Cedric was lit up brightly. Ember cleared her throat, but she and Ash were both smiling now. I still can't get used to it, Ash confessed. My little sister and Cedric Jameson, Wolf Boy extraordinaire. That's Sheriff Wolf Boy now, Ember said. The sisters giggled. Then, warmly, Ash wrapped her arms around Ember, and they hugged tightly. Ember felt tears threatening to spill. When they finally parted, she saw that Ash also looked faintly misty-eyed. Even Luca, not so subtly watching from behind the check-in desk, was sniffing faintly into a tissue. Well, Ash said, how about we check out this pub of yours? Chapter 2. The Broken Broom pub was closed for the evening, which meant that it was empty and quiet when Ember unlocked the door and let Ash inside. The pub had been in the McNair family for a long time. As children, Ash and Ember had both popped in now and then, and usually been treated to an Italian soda or a delectable treat from the dessert display case for their troubles. Ember looked around, trying to see the pub through her sister's eyes. Was she remembering the same things too? Splitting a cherry tart at the bar? Blowing bubbles in their strawberry lemonades? Looks like you've done really well with this place, Ash remarked, after taking a turn around the dining area. Suddenly there was the sound of something rushing into the room. Ash jumped a little, but it was only a small black kitten, who looked up at Ash with bright, appraising eyes. Hello, said the kitten. Hello, Ash replied. You must be Kaylee. Yes, Ember cut in. My familiar. Callie, this is Ash. Why don't we all have a seat? I'll get us some drinks. Ash, what do you want? Maybe just some wine? Sure, Ember said, ducking behind the bar. Ember was a little nervous about Ash and Kaylee meeting. Kaylee had a supernatural ability to pick up on people's energies, to know when they were lying or hiding something. It wasn't that Ember distrusted Ash. It was that she wanted so badly to trust her. And she was worried. If Kaylee started being cagey around the newcomer, that might mean there was something wrong going on here. She needn't have worried. When she returned to the table with some wine, she saw that Kaylee had curled up on Ash's lap and was allowing herself to be thoroughly petted. Her purring sounded like a little vacuum cleaner. Well, Ash said once she and Ember had settled in, I suppose you'll want to hear the whole thing? If that's all right. I'd understand if you were a little tired. Ash shook her head. I want to get this out of the way. I've been holding on to it all for so long, hoping I'd get the chance to explain. She took a sip from her glass of wine. Ember followed suit. So back then, when we were kids, I made some friends and I wanted to start spending time with them. Trouble was, they were dark witches. And spending time with them, well, what I really wanted was to go to a coven meeting. Ember raised her eyebrows, surprised. In all the memories she'd recovered, none of this had come up. You must have kept all this from me. I did. I was careful to. I thought I was old enough to, get to know these characters without falling into any danger, but I didn't want anything bad to happen to you. Obviously, I was wrong. About being old enough, I mean. Did Mom and Dad know? Yeah, Ash said. But only because I asked them. For some reason, I thought, if I was upfront with them, they would be all right with it. would see how responsible I was being, and let me make friends with whoever I wanted so long as I was safe. But they totally freaked out. They tried to forbid me from going. Emphasis on tried? Kaylee remarked, voice muffled from where her face was tucked up against her own fur. That's right, I did try to sneak out, and I even succeeded once or twice. But of course they caught me eventually. It was looking pretty rough. I was in for some serious grounding. Back in those days, that felt like the end of the world, you know? Sure, Ember said, though the truth was she couldn't remember ever having been grounded. It was always Ash who was testing their parents' boundaries in that way. So I borrowed a book of dark magic from one of the other witches, this girl named Cassandra. It was a spell to erase memories. I just wanted to erase their memories of catching me sneaking out. Maybe also their memories of my telling them I was spending time with the Dark Coven in the first place. If only they didn't know, I thought. If I hadn't told them. It went wrong? Ember guessed. That's a very generous understatement. Ash sipped her wine. I was totally unprepared for that level of magic. Instead of erasing the memories I meant to erase, it ended up erasing memories of me from the whole household. That must have been frightening, Ember said. Ash was shaking a little as she nodded, evidently even remembering that time still affected her strongly. I went to Cassandra for help. She'd given me the spellbook, so I thought she could help me figure out how to reverse what I'd done. But all Cassandra told me was that I was a dark witch now. I'd been forgotten by my original family, and now I had a new one, in their coven. Ember gasped. So, did you join with them? Ash shook her head. I left. I felt so guilty about what I'd done. But even feeling that guilt, I couldn't stand the thought of joining up with the Dark Coven. I felt so betrayed by Cassandra. Where did you go? Ash shrugged. Far enough. I opened a jewelry shop of my own. I didn't want to put down roots, because I was always hoping I could come back here. But I never managed to decide when or how to do that. Ember was taking all this information in when a knock sounded on the door. Sorry, Ember said, automatically rising. It's probably some customer who thinks we're open. I'll tell them we're closed. There's no rush, Ash insisted. Kaylee is plenty company for me. Kaylee purred happily to emphasize this point. It was Cedric at the door. Sorry, I thought about calling, but since you were on the way... He pointedly didn't crane his neck to look past Ember into the dining area. He wanted to give Ember and Ash their privacy for their first reunion. It's no trouble at all, Ember said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. What's going on? I just wanted to let you know that I'm heading out of town for a case. Not far, but a little out of my jurisdiction. What's the case? And why are you involved if it's not here in town? Someone asked me as a favor. It's a possible suicide. A local dark witch who lives a little way out? Ember's skin pricked at this. Dark witch? She asked. Anyone I'd know? I'm not sure, Cedric said. You ever meet a woman named Cassandra? Chapter 3. Ember explained to Ash that she had an unexpected emergency, purposefully leaving out any details about what that emergency actually was. If this was the same Cassandra, and she was positive it was, then Ember wanted to break the news to Ash gently. Ash understood and headed back to the fairy tale inn. Ember and Cedric drove to the scene together so she could explain everything she knew about the recently deceased. Cassandra was a dark witch and a powerful one at that, Ember explained. But even dark witches have to start somewhere. Cassandra just so happened to have started around the same time as Ash. How did they know each other? Ember sighed, recounting to Cedric the story she had recently learned. She explained about Ash's interest in dark magic and her coven friends, how Ash had been forbidden by their parents from seeing these friends again, and the magical mistake that had led to Ash's erasure from all of their memories. Wow, Cedric responded incredulously. So Cassandra was inadvertently responsible for all those missing years. Yeah, Ember leaned her head against the car window. I can't believe she's dead, How are you feeling about this whole thing? I can't imagine your feelings toward Cassandra are anything but negative. Humph, Ember grunted. That's an understatement. When Cedric and Ember arrived at Cassandra's home, they passed by an ambulance and police car leaving. Looks like we might have missed Cassandra, Cedric said dryly to Ember as he pointed toward the ambulance with his thumb. They pulled up to a cute cabin-style home surrounded by dense foliage. A man, about Cedric's age, and a young girl were sitting out on the front porch. The young girl was hard at work, scribbling in a coloring book while the man sat nearby, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone. The man looked up when he heard the car approach. Cedric and Ember got out of the car, and the man walked forward to meet them in the driveway, extending his right hand to Cedric first in greeting. "Hey there," he said. "I'm assuming you're with the police?" "You assumed right. I'm Sheriff Cedric Jameson." Cedric pulled out his badge to show the man. "You missed the party. Everyone's already packed up and left." Ember piped up. "We're just here to talk. I hope you don't mind." She intentionally left a pause, hoping he'd offer his name. "Tom." He understood and replied, "I'm Cassandra's husband." "And you are?" "I'm Ember, Cedric's partner." Assuming Tom was more than aware that Cassandra had been a witch, she offered, "And I'm also like Cassandra, if you know what I mean." He nodded in acknowledgement. Unbeknownst to Tom, the little girl had snuck up behind him to see why there were more strange people at her house. "And I'm Alice, Tom's daughter," she exclaimed and comically extended her tiny hand toward Ember. Ember took the hand in her own, gently shaking it. "Hi, Alice," she said, and smiled at the little girl, noticing the splotches of mud dried on the bottom of her yellow dress. "Alice, sweetie." Tom turned to face his daughter. "How about you go back to your coloring? The adults need to talk for a bit." "But I want to talk too," Alice said and pouted at Tom. "We can talk on the porch," Cedric interjected. "That way Alice can keep coloring and we can talk." The four walked back to the porch and took their seats. Alice lay on the ground and returned to her coloring. "So," Tom started, "how can I help?" "We just want to get a detailed picture of what happened," said Cedric. "Well, Alice and I weren't here last night, so I don't know exactly what happened when Cassandra—" He paused and looked down at his daughter. Ember, noticing Tom's distress at mentioning suicide around a 5-year-old, spoke up. "That's okay, you can just tell us what you do know." Tom slowly wrung his hands as he started to explain. "Alice and I went for a little impromptu camping trip last night. When we came back this morning, that's when I found her. Well, you know." Tom kept glancing back at Alice as he recalled the evening. "Was Cassandra acting strangely at all recently? Anything that would suggest she'd do this?" Cedric asked. "So, she hadn't been feeling well, but I didn't think it was depression or anything like that. She even had a visitor come by last night." Cedric and Ember shot up in their seats. "Who was it?" Ember questioned. "I have no idea," Tom replied. "I'd never seen her before. But Cassandra had lots of friends I didn't know about." Ember scrunched up her face and thought, this visitor could have been another dark witch. Tom continued, "Because of her, lifestyle, Cassandra had problems that I stayed out of. She preferred it that way." Given the intense concentration on her face, the three adults had assumed Alice wasn't paying much attention to their conversation. "What lifestyle?" Alice asked without looking up from her coloring page. Cedric, Ember, and Tom looked to one another, hoping that one of them could come up with a reasonable answer. Just, Ember tried, unsure how to respond. Cedric let down his tough exterior and knelt down on the ground next to Alice. She would give him the answer herself. "What do you think, Alice?" "Like magic and stuff?" Alice continued coloring, unfazed. "Exactly," Cedric smirked. He'd sensed the girl would know about her mom. It was difficult to hide that kind of stuff from kids. They were too perceptive. So Alice finally set down her crayon and held up the picture for closer inspection. The image was of a big, fluffy dog lounging in an equally fluffy bed. "That's a very nice picture, Alice," Cedric complimented. Thank you very much, Alice replied, clearly proud she'd remembered her manners. She looked at the picture a moment longer before extending it out to Cedric. You can have it if you want. Cedric's face lit up in seamy mock surprise. Ember had never seen him with kids before. He was a natural. Cedric gratefully took the paper from Alice and gently folded it before putting it in his pocket. He tapped the pocket to show Alice the page was safe. Alice smiled and got to work on the next coloring page. This one was of two cats mid-leap as they attempted to catch a butterfly. Cedric stood up. I think that about does it for us, Tom. This time he was the one to extend a hand for a shake. I appreciate you giving us your time. I'm sorry it's not under better circumstances, Ember added as she too stood up to leave. Thank you both, Tom responded and stood with them. We'll be in touch soon, Cedric said as he and Ember made their way to the car. Tom nodded his head and stuffed the card into his back pocket. He waited in the driveway and watched Cedric and Ember drive away. Once the two were back on the highway, Cedric spoke. Any idea who this mystery visitor could have been? Nope, Ember said. I just hope it's nobody we know. Chapter 4. The next morning, Ember was giving all of the tables in the dining area a quick pre-open wipe-down when she heard a fluttering at her window. This kind of abrupt arrival used to startle Ember. Now she didn't even flinch. Instead, she crossed to the window and slid it open wide enough to allow the bat flapping on the other side to come through. Just don't break any light bulbs, please, she remarked as the bat scurried through the open window. We just changed them out. Once inside, the bat zipped around the room a few times in a wide circle, as though working its energy out. Then it flew to the center of the room, and in a sudden magical surge of transformation, grew outward and upward until there wasn't a bat in front of Ember but rather a woman. Not just any woman either, but Ember's best friend, Sage Wyant. Sage reached up to fix her hair, as though worried the flying or the transformation had ruffled it somehow, but it was sleek and dark as ever. She flashed Ember a bright smile. You heard about the death, huh? Ember asked wryly. Usually the only thing that brought Sage rushing over so urgently before work was when she caught wind of something grisly that had happened in Cockamar. Sage had a natural talent for picking up on local events. That talent came not only through her keen bat auditory senses, but also through her excellent, compassionate insight into human nature. Sage shrugged. This and that. I figured you might know more than I do. I actually might this time, Ember said. Cedric and I went over there. To the scene? Sage asked. Ember nodded. Is that even Cedric's jurisdiction? I thought Cassandra lived outside of town. I guess someone called in a favor, wanted him to take a look. Evidently someone who thought he might have a unique insight into this one. Sure, Sage agreed easily. Call in the wolf-shifter cop to investigate the Dark Witch's death. Makes sense to me. So Sage joined Ember in wiping down the tables, and in the meantime, Ember filled Sage in on everything she'd learned so far, stopping just short of bringing up Cassandra's connection to Ash. Sage listened, considering. Ember paused in her cleaning, watching her friend and waiting to hear Sage's theories. Ember did not expect what Sage said next. You know I babysit Alice sometimes? Ember blinked. No, I had no idea. Seriously? Sage nodded. Tom's ex-wife, Rose, is a fellow shifter. She and I are friendly. We talk a lot. Does she have opinions about Cassandra? Sage scoffed. Does she? I mean, she's not like a vicious gossip or anything. Rose is actually super nice. It took her a while to tell me anything about Cassandra. I think she didn't want to seem like she was putting rumors out there or anything like that. So what did she tell you once she started talking to you? Nothing too incriminating, Sage said, except that basically no one liked Cassandra. I guess she was a witch with a capital B. You know what I mean? Very interesting, Kaylee said, trotting into the room. Is there anyone in particular who seemed to dislike Cassandra? Kaylee was followed by Talico, the pub ghost, looking handsome and upright as ever. "Dislike Cassandra?" Sage asked. "I thought this was a suicide." "It looks like a suicide," Ember confessed. "But even if it is, there could have been some reason. A conflict she was having with someone, for instance?" Sage shrugged. "The way Rose tells it, just about anyone who's encountered Cassandra had some reason to hate her. So I'm sorry I can't narrow that down, but it does sound like the family in general is better off without her." "Now, Sage, we shouldn't speak that way of the dead," Talico scolded gently. "Though I will say that, of course, sometimes chosen family can be more powerful than blood family." "Well, I'm not sure anyone who really knew Cassandra would have chosen her as family, is all I'm saying," Sage said. "Would you know anything about the visitor Tom mentioned?" Ember asked. "Any idea who that might have been?" "I mean, I can't know for sure," Sage said, "but it occurred to me that it might have been Meredith." Ember felt a little chill run down her spine at the name. "Meredith?" Talico asked. "Meredith Cooper," Kaylee explained. "She's the head of the Dark Coven, isn't she?" "That's the one," Sage answered. "Long, scraggly, gray, hag-like hair. Walks all hunched over." "Those terrifying eyes," Ember said with a shudder. "Honestly, Talico, she looks like the Wicked Witch out of just about every fairy tale ever. Not a poster child for positive witch PR." "I think she plays it up," Kaylee remarked lightly. "She's not even that old." "What was her deal with Cassandra?" Ember asked Sage. "I don't know the details, but from what I've heard, they had some sort of falling out over the coven at some point." Again, Sage shrugged. A take-it-or-leave-it gesture that told Ember her intel ended there. "Worth looking into, if you can bring yourself to question that woman." Ember laughed, shoving the chilly feeling away. "I think I can handle Meredith Cooper." "But do you even have time?" Sage asked. "What with your wedding and your sister coming to town?" "Yeah," Ember said uneasily. "About that." She explained to Sage the connection between Ash and Cassandra. Sage's eyes went wide. "Now that seems suspicious," Sage said. "It's not suspicious," Ember objected, flushing. "I like Ash," Kaylee said plainly, "and I'm very good at reading people." Sage honestly did seem a little reassured at Kaylee's endorsement of Ash. Even so, Ember could tell that her friend still wasn't sure how far Ember's mysterious reappearing sister could be trusted. After all, an old enemy of hers turned up dead as soon as Ash resurfaced in town. If Ash was anyone else, Ember would be suspicious too. Chapter 5. Cathy O'Connell squealed and wrapped her arms around Ember, hugging her tightly. "I'm just so happy for you. You're getting married." Ember couldn't help but laugh. This was the 5th time Cathy had interrupted their meeting, during which they were supposed to be finalizing the plans for catering the wedding, to hug Ember in happiness. Lila Delacroix, an old fairy who owned Sweet Things Bakery and who was set to make the cake at Ember and Cedric's wedding, was also present at the meeting. Lila was considerably less chipper about it. For a fairy, Lila could be rather ill-tempered. At each of Cathy's outbursts, Lila gave a distinct huff. She side-eyed Cathy irritably. "Yes," Lila said wryly to Ember. "Mazel tov. Now, can we talk about decorations? I've got to get back to the kitchen. We're almost out of kolaches." Just then, Ember's phone buzzed. She extricated herself from Cathy and shot Lila an apologetic look. Cedric's name was on the screen. Cathy gasped delightedly. "It's the groom." "You mean a woman's fiancé is calling her? On the telephone?" Lila muttered under her breath, rolling her eyes elaborately. Ember stifled a giggle as she left the 2 women in the room. Lila's bark was worse than her bite, and Cathy could more than hold her own. But still, Ember did feel a little guilty leaving the 2 of them alone. "Hello?" "Hi," Cedric said. "Where are you?" "Catering appointment, remember?" Ember asked. Cedric had been supposed to come with her, but Cassandra's death had thrown a wrench in that plan. Right, Cedric muttered, clearly distracted. How is that going?" Ember chuckled. Listen, you clearly want to tell me something. Why don't I save the catering details for when you actually have the attention to hear about them? Cedric laughed sheepishly. Yeah, sorry, that would probably be best. Listen, I just wanted to let you know. It looks like Cassandra was definitely murdered. Ember paused a beat to take that in. It had been easier not to worry about all of this when she believed Cassandra had committed suicide. Maybe there was still a chance. How do you know? There was a thinner ligature mark beneath the rope that had been used to hang her, Cedric explained. She was strangled before she was hoisted up. So it was staged? Looks that way, Cedric said. But by someone who either didn't realize how straightforward it would be on our end to figure out what had really happened, or else someone who was so desperate they didn't have another choice. Okay. Ember tried to breathe, but she couldn't help but feel the anxiety welling within her. So, what's next? Well, next I guess I head back out to Tom's place. Try to see if I can't get a better idea of what happened. Is there any chance that I can join in on that? I don't see why not, Cedric said. I've got a little paperwork to deal with over here first, but then I'll come and get you. At the pub? Yeah, Ember agreed. See you there. Ember wrapped up her appointment with Cathy and Lila as quickly as she could, then returned to the broken broom. Ash was just walking up outside when Ember arrived. Hey, Ash said. I was just going to drop in and see if I could catch you in action. Ash was wearing a leather jacket and combat boots, but something about her messy pixie cut made her look equally soft as edgy. To Ember, there was something vulnerable about her, something that awoke every protective instinct Ember had. Sure, Ember said. Let's have lunch. The broken broom was bustling, but luckily there was a nice private booth in the corner that had recently been occupied. Ember bussed and cleaned it and then gestured for Ash to sit down. She fetched them both some lunch and drinks and then joined Ash. What's going on? Ash was watching Ember warily. Evidently her sister, who she hadn't seen in years, still knew her well enough to be able to tell when there was something on her mind. Of course, the fact that she'd had to race off the night before without providing any answers as to where she was going? Well, that had to be a contributing factor, too. As gently as she could, Ember told Ash about what had happened. She kept a close eye on Ash for her reaction. To Ember, it looked like Ash was surprised by the news, but it was a subdued response, so she couldn't be sure. What kind of person am I, scrutinizing my own sister like she's a murder suspect? Ember couldn't help but be troubled by her own behavior. When Ember had finished, Ash shifted uncomfortably. I mean, that's awful, and everything, but Cedric is in for a really tough job. Why so? Ash shrugged. Because it could have been literally anyone. Cass was a terrible person. You think someone hated her enough to kill her? I'd say that's a safe bet, Ash muttered. Probably someone powerful. Someone who knew to kill her in such a way that she couldn't speak any spells while they were attacking. Who would know something like that? Ember asked, though she was already getting an idea. I'd recommend you check out the local dark witches. They would have power to kill. And probably the motivation, since I'm sure Cass was kicking up trouble in the coven. It was sort of her natural state. I hadn't thought of that, Ember remarked. It was a good idea, but a little worrying. Ember had lived her life steering far clear of dark covens and magic. Well, it looked like that policy might have reached its end. Hey, Ash said, looking over Ember's shoulder. Isn't that your guy? Ember turned. Indeed, Cedric was walking into the pub right at that moment, ready to take Ember to Tom's place. Ash, Cedric greeted her pleasantly as he approached the booth. Nice to see you again. I know we barely got the chance to say hello last night. Yeah, and now I hear it's because you're looking into a murder case, Ash asked, smiling tightly. You've really grown up from when we all used to play cops and robbers as kids, haven't you? The two shook hands warmly as Ember gathered her things together and prepared to go. So sorry for this, she said to Ash. We're just going to... I just have to, Yeah, of course, Ash insisted, waving her hands. You two head out. I'll see you around? Yes, absolutely. Ember hugged her sister. Again, she felt that, under all those protective layers, the woman's body was oddly small, vulnerable, fragile, that she had to be protected. Chapter 6. Tom must have heard them coming up the drive because by the time Ember and Cedric pulled up to his house, he was standing out on the porch waiting for them. Well, come on in, he said faintly as they approached. He stepped into the house and waved them through. Y'all want something to drink? I think well, I could make tea. Alice has some lemonade, I believe. Water, of course, though it's just from the tap. No, thank you, Ember answered kindly. I think we're all right. Is Alice around? Cedric was gazing around the room, nostrils flaring slightly, as though trying to track the child. Just in the other room, Tom said. Sleeping, I think. At least she was last I saw. He looked strangely tense, as though he was bracing himself for something. Ember realized he must know that they had brought news, and he was afraid to hear what it was. Well, Tom, Cedric started, voice calm and clear, but low enough that Alice in the other room wouldn't be able to overhear. It looks like Cassandra was murdered. Tom blinked. To Ember, he looked utterly unsurprised. Sure, he said eventually. She was a pretty frightening lady when she wanted to be. So you're not surprised someone wanted to kill her? Tom shrugged. She spent a whole lot of time with bad people. Bad? Ember prompted. You know the type. Unsavory. Dangerous, even. He shuddered. I did tell her I didn't want those types around here, what with Alice and all. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I felt threatened by them too. Not that she really took my requests seriously. Ember and Cedric exchanged a look. If Cassandra was bringing dangerous dark magic practitioners to the house, then that was a pretty serious concern. You mentioned she would hang around with dangerous types, Cedric said. Does anyone in particular stand out? Tom laughed humorlessly. Just a second, I can show you. With that, he crossed to an innocuous-looking desk that sat across the room and began to rifle through it. Under his breath, he was muttering to himself. Where did she keep it? Where is it now? Uh-huh. There we go. Considering all the buildup, Ember was expecting him to pull out something dramatic, like maybe a weapon. Instead, when he walked back toward Ember and Cedric, he was holding what looked like a perfectly normal 3-ring binder. Why don't y'all have a seat? You can look through these. He showed Ember and Cedric over to the nearby Davenport. They sat and held the binder between them. The binder was full of various documents, evidently written on different types of paper at different times. Some were types, some were handwritten, and some had more signs of wear than others. But they all very clearly were united by a single theme. Are they all like this? Ember asked, shuddering. What you mean, full of hateful letters and threats and curses? Tom responded. Yeah, all of them. At least as far as I could stand to read them. Quite a collection, isn't it? Why would she keep something like this? Ember wondered aloud. She liked to look through them and laugh at it. The voice came from the mouth of the hallway. Alice was standing there, dressed in a pair of elephant print pajamas and clutching a stuffed penguin under one arm. Tom turned to his daughter in surprise. Hey, sweetie, up from your nap? Alice yawned and nodded. You said you saw Cassandra with this binder, Cedric asked her gently. Laughing at it? Again, Alice nodded. She told me the notes were funny, but then she read one to me and it wasn't very funny. A chill passed down Ember's spine. She couldn't imagine reading any of these letters to a little girl. It was scarring enough for Ember to read them as a grown woman. All right, Cedric said, hoisting the binder and standing. Thanks for your help, Tom. We'd better move along for now, but we'll be in touch. Of course, Tom said. Anything we can do to be of help. In the meantime, would you mind if I took this with me? Cedric gestured to the binder. Please do. It'd make me feel better to get that thing out of the house anyway. Cedric and Ember thanked Tom and made to leave. There is just one thing, actually, Ember added as they were walking to the door. That visitor Cassandra had, just before, well? She paused with a look at Alice, not wanting to refer directly to such a violent event around a child. Do you have any clue who that could have been? Tom shook his head. Sorry, no, I've been thinking about it, but nothing's come to mind. Alice and I were already out the back door by the time the front doorbell rang. Back in the car, Cedric passed the binder to Ember after they both buckled up. I'm not looking forward to how much reading I have to do now. He groaned, dismayed. This is a doorstopper, Ember agreed, hefting the binder. Who collects this much hate mail anyway? If I didn't know better, I'd think I was holding a Tolstoy manuscript right now. I wish it was a Tolstoy manuscript, Cedric said. At least then it might make for interesting reading. Ember hated to disagree, but she had a strong feeling that there would be some very interesting details in this binder, even if it did involve sifting through a lot of vitriol to get to it. Where to? Cedric asked once he'd steered the car back into the city limits of Cockamar. Fairy Tales Inn, please, chauffeur. Cedric smiled over at her. Are you spending more time with your sister? Ember nodded eagerly. I owe her a good dinner at least after ditching her over lunch, Ember replied. Maybe she'll be willing to run a few errands with me first, to work up a nice appetite. Well, you two have a lovely time, Cedric said as he pulled up in front of the inn. Before Ember could turn to open her door, Cedric was getting out and rounding the car to open it for her. She blushed happily, then allowed him to draw her into a quick parting kiss. As he pulled away, he nudged her nose with his. Good luck with the case, she said. Thanks, he answered. Good luck with Ash. Though neither of them said it out loud, both Ember and Cedric couldn't help worrying that it was only a matter of time before the case and Ember's sister collided. Chapter 7. Hey, Ember, Luca greeted warmly as Ember walked into the lobby of the Fairy Tales Inn. Here to see your special guest? Ember grinned and nodded. Did she get back okay? I had to kind of abandon her at lunch. You know she's a native of Kashmar and not some green tourist, right? Luca said with a teasing tone. The lady knows her way around. Ember laughed self-consciously. Right, of course. I knew that. She did know that, but it was difficult not to think of Ash as someone who had newly walked into her life. Even with all her memories so vividly restored, she could also remember the time when she couldn't remember. It took some serious gear shifting sometimes to readjust to the fact of Ash and to connect the girl she loved to the woman she was just getting to know. She's upstairs if you want to see her, Luca said. Room 9. Ember thanked her friend sheepishly and raced up the stairs and down the hall to room 9. She took a second to brace herself before knocking. Doors open, Ash called through. When Ember walked in, she found that Ash was seated in the chair at the little hotel desk. Arranged all over its surface was an array of plastic containers that looked like miniature translucent briefcases. Several were closed and stacked up into a tidy pile, but others were gaping open, showing small boxy compartments filled with multicolored beads. Ash was busy with something in her hands. When Ember drew closer, she saw that Ash was delicately plucking up small amber-colored beads and threading them onto some kind of elastic thread. What you got there? Ash jumped a little and looked up, smiling. I thought it was housekeeping or something. You're back already? I couldn't stay away too long. Ember craned to look closer at the item Ash was holding. Ash opened her palm so Ember could see. A bracelet? Ash nodded. I budgeted for a lot of downtime while I'm here in Kashmar. So I can see, Ember said, gesturing to the generous collection of beads. Now that she took a second look at them, one of the little cases of beads snagged her interest. Most of them looked like the kind of thing you could get from any high-quality crafting store, colored resin or painted porcelain or little gourd stones. But near Ash's elbow, next to a few spools of thin wire, there was a little cracked open case that Ember could just barely see into. The beads inside looked innocuous enough, but unlike the other cases, These beads gave off a strong impression of magical energy. Ember looked from the case to Ash, curious. Did Ash know that Ember's magic was honed enough to be able to pick up on that sort of energy? No, of course, there were probably all kinds of wonderful uses for magical beads. Ember had heard of magic jewelry that had healing and protective powers, and others that promoted luck or energy or pleasant dreams. Did Ash sell those kinds of things in her jewelry store? To all appearances, Ash seemed not to notice Ember's attention flicker. Instead, she had returned to her rapid, precise beating motions. Sorry for ditching you at lunch, by the way. No way, don't apologize, Ash insisted warmly. This is your hometown and your life and the week of your wedding. Ditch away. Ember smiled. Still, you came here for me. Ash shrugged. It's nice just to be back. Weird, but nice. The food at the Broken Broom was great, by the way. Way better than what the pub used to sell back when we were kids, remember? I think I could have broken a window with that cornbread. Oh, I remember, Ember said. I lost a tooth in it once. It was one of her baby teeth, of course, but the memory still frightened her. It had taken her years to trust a bite of cornbread again. Ash chuckled. And now look at you, running the place and solving murders and all that. By the way, has anyone talked to Meredith yet, by any chance? No, not yet, Ember said. But we did find something interesting at Tom and Cassandra's house. Oh, yeah? Yeah. Ember took a perched seat at the foot of the bed. This huge collection of hate mail Cassandra had received. She saved them all up for who knows how long. I guess she kept it in some binder. Anyway, it seems pretty clear we'll get a much better picture of who had it out for this woman when we look through it. With a sound like rainfall, a dozen or so amber beads went spilling to the ground. Oh my gosh, Ash said, a little louder than was natural, and the laugh that accompanied the words was nervous and skittery. Already she was setting aside the bracelet she was working on and dropping to the ground, hands racing over the floorboards to pick up the scattered beads. I'm so clumsy. Sorry, could you lift your shoe? I think one rolled under... Yeah, right there. Yeah. By the time Ember had figured out what happened and dropped to the floor to help Ash pick the beads up, they were already gathered, and within seconds Ash was deftly beating again. Something I said just then made her nervous. The thought flashed across her mind once, fleeting but indelible. What was it? What had she said to make Ash so frightened? Hey, Ash said, lifting her gaze to look at Ember. Is it true that someone was murdered here at the inn? Once Ash had finished the bracelet she was working on, she and Ember took a walk around town. They dropped in on a few stores, and Ash helped Ember to pick out a few extra decorative flourishes for the wedding reception. Ash had a good eye, and Ember appreciated her discerning, tasteful guidance. What she appreciated even more, however, was the time spent with her sister. After they'd finished their shopping, Ash insisted on returning to the Broken Broom, where she asked Ember if it would be all right for her to help out around the pub for the evening. Ash must have waited a few tables during her time away from Kaushmar, because she was a natural, joking with customers, taking down orders, raking in the tips. By the end of the night, Ember felt confident letting Tara and Annie head home, and she and Ash handled all the closing work together. Still, all that time, try as she might, Ember couldn't get her mind over those spilled beads, or the nagging thought that Ash was hiding something from her. Chapter 8. When Cedric walked into the Broken Broom the next morning during the breakfast hour, he looked utterly exhausted. Still, Ember knew better than to remark on it. He wasn't a vain man by any means, but he might feel self-conscious knowing he was going into work looking quite so unrested. Instead of saying anything, Ember ensured that by the time he made it over to the bar, there was a piping hot cup of coffee waiting for him, and an order in the kitchen for a full breakfast plate. I love you, he said with conviction as he pulled up a stool. Is that for me or the coffee? She joked. You, of course, he answered. Then, looking at the coffee, he added, Well, mostly. And how are you this fine morning, my shining husband-to-be? She batted her eyelashes performatively. He looked up from his first long sip of coffee and smiled at her, a little more wakeful already. Then, he reached out a hand, captured the collar of her shirt, and tugged her gently so that she was leaning far enough over the bar for him to sit forward and kiss her. "Fine," he said. "Except that I stayed up all night reading those horrible letters." "Did you finish them?" He shook his head. "Not by a long shot. Still got several hours to go, I'd say." He took a second sip and then started looking up and down the bar. "Well?" Ember prodded, grabbing the little silver creamer filled with half and half from under the bar and placing it in front of Cedric. Usually he took his coffee black, but sometimes when he was very stressed he indulged himself in a little dressing up. "What did you find out?" He gratefully plucked up the creamer and dribbled a line into his mug, where it went cloudy and started to dissipate like blown smoke, turning the deep brown liquid to almost a caramel color. She handed him a spoon and he started to stir, distracted. "Lots of letters from Meredith already," he remarked. "And by lots, I mean lots. That woman does not mind signing her name onto some pretty serious threats. I'll tell you what. Sage was right to recommend we talk to her." Might be just about time to check in with her, don't you think?" Cedric smiled at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "What does your morning look like?" Ember didn't fancy going to talk to someone as intimidating as Meredith Cooper without backup, and Cedric's schedule was too busy to make the time. Ember wished she could ask Ash, but considering Ash's connection to the victim, that didn't seem like a great idea. Luckily, Sage jumped at the opportunity to come along. "I'm totally fascinated by this woman," Sage said as she swung into the passenger seat of her car. "Like, literally everyone is terrified of her. People practically cross themselves when her name comes up. And that makes you interested to get to know her?" Ember asked. Sage shrugged. "Well, it's some seriously intense branding, if nothing else." "From the sounds of it, she's done plenty to earn it," Ember remarked. As they drove out toward Meredith's house, Ember brought Sage up to speed on the letters Cedric had found in Cassandra's collection. By the time they reached Meredith's cottage deep in the swampy woods, even Sage was feeling a little anxious about the encounter. "Yikes," Sage said as she peered out the windshield at the cottage. "This is like the place we get cooked and eaten, right?" Ember tried to laugh, but it sounded small and frightened even in her own ears. "We'll just be here a few minutes, hopefully." This far out of town, the frogs and crickets made a startlingly loud noise, even in the middle of the morning. "Anything?" Ember asked Sage in an undertone when they got out of the car. Sage's nostrils flared. A familiar smell. Can't quite place it. And that sound... What is that? As soon as Sage mentioned it, Ember could hear it. At first, she thought that there must be something screaming out far in the woods, but that steady, shrieking noise turned out to be the creak of a rocking chair out on the porch. Only when Ember and Sage drew closer did they realize that the rocking chair held Meredith Cooper in it. Ember had almost mistaken her for a pile of old rags. "Hello?" Ember said with a faint, anxious wave as they walked up. "Miss Cooper?" "Yes?" Meredith asked. Her voice was like a rusted hinge, and her eyes were trailing Ember sharply, like a falcon tracking its prey. "Sorry to bust in on you like this," Sage piped up, sounding significantly less frightened than Ember. "We were just hoping to ask you a few questions." "Questions?" Meredith was guarded, bordering on hostile. Unless Ember was mistaken, they were about 2 seconds away from being chased off the property. "Yes," Ember added quickly, figuring it would be best to get to the point. "About Cassandra Alden's death." To Ember's surprise, Meredith's expression changed in a second. She cracked a gapped, delighted smile, one that somehow made her seem even more hostile and terrifying than her glare had done. "About time someone offed that one," she remarked almost casually, except for the little cackling laugh that followed. Sage and Ember exchanged a look. Ember raised one eyebrow significantly. "Would you mind letting us know what you were up to the night of Cassandra's death?" Meredith's laugh dried up at this, and so did her smile. She looked at them with a fish-eyed scowl and crossed her spindly arms over her chest. I was off with some friends. Friends? Ember prompted. Meredith smirked wickedly. Dark coven witches. I don't think you'd know them. Cassandra's coven? No, Meredith snapped, sharp and brittle. My own coven, which is superior to Cassandra's in every way. Then, Meredith rose from the rocker, which seemed suddenly, supernaturally still, as soon as Meredith's body left it. Now, if you don't mind? Gruffly, she shouldered her way past Ember and Sage to her own door and tempestuously breezed through it. Just before she was about to snap it closed behind her, she shouted out to them, "You might want to ask your sister, Miss McNair. She stopped by here a few days ago asking where she might find Cassandra." Chapter 9. Well, Sage remarked once they were back in the car. That was terrifying. Yeah, Ember agreed, already eagerly turning the vehicle back around. She couldn't get back into the Kokmar city limits fast enough. How about I feed you breakfast to thank you for backing me up there? I should probably get back to the shop, Sage said reluctantly. You sure? Ember prompted. Biscuits and gravy are on special this morning? Sage beamed. Well, it's the least you could do. When Ember and Sage walked into the Broken Broom, Ash was sitting at a table with a tatty paperback book and a cinnamon-flecked latte in a large mug. She looked up at their entrance and waved them over. Hey, Ash said warmly, rising to her feet. You must be Sage. I've heard so much about you from Ember. She held out her hand to shake. Yep, Sage answered, hesitating just a second before accepting the handshake. Under normal circumstances, Sage probably would have bypassed the hand entirely and gone in for the hug. Ember knew that Sage wasn't sure whether to trust Ash. And after what they'd both heard from Meredith, Ember wasn't sure she could blame Sage either. Still, when Ash insisted that they eat at her table, Sage accepted civilly enough. And by the time their order actually came out to them, the two were chatting pleasantly. So Ember didn't feel too badly when her phone rang and she had to excuse herself to take the call, leaving Sage and Ash alone. It was Cedric calling. Case information or wedding information? Ember asked. Case, he said. Talk screen came back. And? Cedric took a deep breath. There were traces of rat poison in Cassandra's system. Yeesh, Ember remarked. Rat poison? Well, I guess we know why she wasn't feeling well in the days leading up to her death. It definitely looks that way, Cedric agreed. Then, in a serious voice, he added, Listen, there's something else I want to talk to you about, but I want to talk to you in person. Are you at the pub? Yeah. She wanted to ask what is it, but she knew that Cedric would give her a heads up if he thought that was best. I'm here with Sage and Ash. Okay, he said. I'll be there soon. Did you talk to Meredith by any chance? Sage and I went. She claims she was out with members of her dark coven on the night question. Get any names? No, but I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard to figure out who's in her coven if we need to, Ember said. Particularly if we get Segi onto the gossip beat. Great, is that all? Ember considered telling Cedric about what Meredith had told her regarding Ash's visit. However, something made her stop. Yeah, she said. That's all. When she returned to the table, Ember was wearing an expression of deep concern. Sage, who was deeply attentive to the moods and energies of everyone around her at all times, and particularly to those of her best friend, couldn't help but notice Ember's confused, worried demeanor. Well, Sage said in a loud, bright voice, I've been hearing some good news lately. There was a brief pause in which Sage waited for Ember to ask about the good news. Ember, however, seemed off in another world. Luckily, Ash stepped in. Oh, yeah? She was a beat too late, and her eyes were also on Ember, but Sage was grateful for the contribution all the same. I was talking to Rose Erickson last night. Remember her, Ember? I mentioned she was a friend of mine, a fellow shifter. Ember blinked and looked at Sage. Rose. Right. Yes, I remember. She's Tom's ex-wife, Sage explained to Ash. Well, it turns out that after Cassandra and all that, Rose has been visiting with Tom and Alice more than ever before. Several times a day, even. I guess, according to Rose, both of them seem even happier and healthier now than they were before. And Rose is grateful to get the opportunity to visit with them without being chased off by Cassandra. Why did Rose and Tom divorce anyway? Ember asked. Sage shrugged. I'm not even sure Rose really knows. If she does, she doesn't talk about it much. But I guess it happened pretty suddenly. A sudden divorce, Ember mused. Is that normal? Ash and Sage both shrugged. I guess it is if something happened, Ash offered. Anyway, Tom got custody as some kind of fluke, Sage said. Rose was totally heartbroken. Wait, Ember said. Alice isn't Cassandra's daughter? Sage shook her head. Remember, I said that I would babysit Alice because I'm friends with Rose? Alice is Rose and Tom's. Right. Ember took in this new information. It wasn't surprising, per se, but somehow she hadn't been expecting it. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Not least of which because Alice is an adorable little sweetie, Sage said insistently. And Cassandra was, well, Sage cut a nervous look in Ash's direction, but Ash appeared to be busying herself by swilling the last of her latte around in the bottom of her cup, chasing stray cinnamon granules. When she looked up, she didn't glance at either Sage or Ember but at the door of the broken broom. Ash's eyes widened. Ember and Sage both turned. Cedric was walking in, his eyes trained right on Ash. Stiffly, he made his way up to the table. Everything about his body language was tense. He didn't so much as glance at Ember the whole time he approached. She felt a deep, hollow fear. Something was wrong. Sage also felt that there was something off about both Cedric and Ash. Ash looked like she was ready to bolt, and Cedric like he was preparing to give chase. "Morning, Sheriff," Sage said brightly, in yet another attempt at pleasant distraction. "What do you have in your hand there?" He was holding what looked like a letter. At Sage's question, he set the letter down on the table, right in front of Ash. Something I'm hoping Ash here can explain. Chapter 10. Ember's eyes flashed to Ash, then back at Cedric. His focus didn't waver. Ash shifted in her seat. "What is it? Why are you staring at me?" Her demeanor defensive, she sat up tall and pulled her shoulders back. Cedric tapped a finger on the letter. "This is a letter from you to Cassandra, and it's not asking her to be your pen pal." Ember and Sage shot a glance at each other, then back to Ash, who was rubbing the side of her face, which had turned rather pale. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Ember peered at the letter. Was this one of the letters in the binder that Tom found? Finally, Cedric pulled his gaze from Ash. His face softened as he looked at Ember. "Yes, I'm afraid it is." "What does it say?" "Well, it appears that Ash was not Cassandra's biggest fan." Ember indicated for him to continue. The basic theme of the letter is how Ash thinks Cassandra ruined her life. It's angry and bitter and includes a threat or two for good measure. "It was a long time ago." Ash raised her hands in frustration. "I haven't written to her in almost a decade." Ember moved closer to her and bent her head. "He has to ask these questions, Ash. It's his job." "Yeah, well, I bet he's already got his handcuffs out ready to slap on me." Cedric shook his head, sighed, and sat in the chair opposite. "Ash, you can see how it looks." "Yes, but that letter is old. I moved on. I took the anger expressed in that letter, and instead of choking on it, I used it to motivate myself to be a better person and make something of myself." Ember touched a finger to nose for a moment before turning to Cedric. "Isn't there a way you could check how old the letter is?" "Maybe the postmark," she offered with a small squeal of inspiration. Cedric picked up the envelope and handed it to Ember. "There is no postmark." "Oh," Ember said, dejected. What about the age of the paper? I'm sure I've read somewhere that you can decipher the age of a piece of paper. Cedric shook his head and smiled affectionately. Maybe on those crime fiction stories you watch with the big, expensive labs, but here in Cauchamar, Louisiana, we have to do things a little more old school. Plus, it's been kept really well in the dark, so I'm not so sure any of that fancy equipment would work. Ash looked at Ember, expecting a reassuring look, but she wriggled her nose in thought. Ember wanted to believe Ash, but she also wanted to ask her about visiting Meredith. Her mind began whirling, and she inadvertently began to sway. Ash broke the silence by scraping her chair back so she could stand. She slammed both palms on the table. Well, I know what you all think. She glared at each one in turn. Sage looked down and Ember was jolted out of her thoughts. Before she could say anything, Ash knocked her chair over and moved away from the table. Cedric, you can come get me at the inn if you want to arrest me. Both Sage and Cedric looked to Ember, whose mouth opened in shock. And I thought better of you, Ember. This isn't what I hoped for when I thought we were going to be a family again. Ember managed a short, but Ash, please don't. Before Ash made a dramatic exit from the pub. There was a brief moment of silence before Cedric rose from his seat to go and comfort Ember. You okay? Ember swallowed the lump which had formed in her throat and nodded. Cedric wrapped both arms around her shoulders and squeezed. Don't take it to heart. I remember Ash was always quick-tempered, always spouting out the first nasty thing that came into her head before putting it through any sort of filter. Ember looked into his eyes and gave him a half-smile. He kissed her gently on the cheek. You know she'll be back to apologize later, and all will be forgiven, and all will be right with the world. Okay, now you're going over the top, said Sage, standing and pulling her bag off the arm of the chair. It started off sweet, but now I have to leave before I throw up. Cedric released Ember from his grip and turned to Sage, who gave him a mock puke face and smiled. Ember's shoulders fell as she laughed and walked over to hug her friend. What would I ever do without you? Sage hugged her back and replied, Fail to unleash your inner diva and live a life of ambiguous normality. Sage kissed her friend on the cheek, then did the same to Cedric before leaving. As they looked after her, Cedric added, I don't think Sage is convinced of Ash's innocence. I noticed she's been very distant with her. And what about you? Said Ember. What's that famous gut telling you? Cedric screwed up the right side of his face. My gut isn't always right, but I'm sorry to say that she is currently my #1 suspect. Ember sighed. She so wanted to believe in Ash, but with Cedric's gut instinct and the incriminating evidence of a letter to the victim discussing how she would like to kill her, it wasn't hard to think that he could be right. Chapter 11. Once Cedric had left to go back to the station, Ember sat in silence, running her finger around the rim of her glass. She needed another suspect for the investigation to concentrate on, and she needed a distraction. At that moment, her phone rang. It was Sage. Hi, Sage, you okay? I was ringing to ask you the same thing. Sorry I should have stayed with you. Ember smiled. Thanks. I can't stop feeling like I've let Ash down. I know you want her to be innocent, but you can't let personal feelings interfere with an investigation. You have to follow wherever the leads take you, no matter how uncomfortable it is. Ember laughed. Did you just quote Sheriff Jameson? Yeah, but don't tell him. I'll never hear the end of it. I also had a thought, Sage added. Why don't we visit Rose, my fellow shifter? Ember thought for a second. I do need a distraction, and she might be able to give us some background. Excellent, I'll pick you up in an hour. Sage, I forgot to ask, what does Rose shift into? A rat. Oh, nice. The drive to Rose's house was a pleasant one, taking them off the main roads and into some pretty woodland. Ember let the window down in the car and breathed in the fresh morning air. They arrived at the house, which sat within a small copse and looked like something out of a fairy story, with its red-tiled roof and white picket fence. Ember smiled as she imagined herself and Cedric in a house just like it. Rose was busy in the garden at the side of the house. She stood to greet them. Hi, this is a nice surprise. She took off her gloves and gave Sage a light hug. Hi, Rose, Sage began. I hope you don't mind us dropping in on you. No, it's fine, especially as I need some help with this darn wire. I need to support these tomato plants. Sage smiled and took some of the wire. Rose squatted down and Sage held up the plant for her. So, Rose, we were hoping you could tell us a little about Cassandra, Ember said. Rose stood. That woman was a narcissistic bully who would get whatever she wanted any way that she could, and she didn't care whose toes she stepped on to do it. Safe to say you weren't best friends then? Sage said, trying to diffuse the tension that had suddenly filled the air. Rose shook her head and stabbed at the air with her secateurs. That woman got what was coming to her, and I, for one, am very grateful for whoever got to squeeze the life out of that venomous snake. So what happened between you and Tom? Sage asked. Was your breakup anything to do with Cassandra? Ember stood listening, glad that Sage was asking the important questions. Rose's posture slumped as she recalled what happened. Cassandra stole Tom and Alice from me. We were happy, a family with a future. Sage placed her hand on Rose's, who was looking into the distance. Rose felt her touch and came back to the present. How did she steal them? Sage asked. If you were so happy, surely... Rose's face hardened. Because she used her black magic on them. Trust me, there is no other way that she would have come between us. So you really think she used magic on them? Sage continued. Of course she did. That woman wanted my family and she gave Tom a love potion or something. He was besotted and he wasn't himself at all. I tried to pull him out of it, but her magic was too strong. Rose turned as a tear fell onto her cheek. She discreetly wiped it away with the back of her hand. Sage bent down to continue with the tomatoes before asking, So what happened then? Tom divorced me and that woman manipulated the custody hearing. Not happy with just taking my husband from me, she took my baby too. Another tear formed ready to drop before Rose took in a deep breath and stood tall. Anyway, I'm overjoyed that she is dead, and I'm sure if there is a hell, that's where she is. I'm so sorry that happened to you, Sage said, giving Rose a sympathetic smile. That was a terrible thing she did. It seems like she ruined a lot of lives. She looked across at Ember. There was a moment of awkward silence before Rose gathered herself again. I'm so sorry. Where are my manners? Would you ladies care for some tea? Why don't we finish this first? Sage said, indicating the tomatoes and passing some of the wire to Ember. The conversation was light and friendly as the three women discussed the vegetables in the garden, and Ember enthused about how lovely she thought the house was. Once they'd finished with the tomatoes, Rose made iced tea and they drank it outside on an intricate ironwork dining set, which Ember thought matched the style of the house perfectly. As they were about to leave, Ember asked Rose the question she had gone there to ask. So, where were you, Rose, when Cassandra was murdered? Sage's eyes widened and she looked at Rose, whose face turned from friendly to fierce. Her beady eyes turned black, hinting at her alter ego. Are you accusing me of murder? Rose said tightly. No, of course not. Ember decided to tread carefully. If she was the killer, she didn't want her as an enemy. It's just that the sheriff's department will want to know, and we can save them the trip. Rose stood, picked up the tray, and began loading the empty cups onto it. I didn't kill that odious woman, but I'm glad she's dead. Now, if that's all, I'm very busy, and I think it's time you left. Chapter 12. They arrived back at the pub, and Ember said goodbye to Sage, then made her way to the kitchen to grab something to eat. As she sat recounting the events of the day in her head and poking her fork into the chicken pie on her plate, she realized that Rose hadn't actually given them an alibi. Her mind then wandered to Meredith as Talako appeared at the opposite end of the table. You look troubled, child, he said, tilting his head to one side. Ember sighed. Yes, I suppose I am. Can I help? Ember eyed Talako and smiled a knowing smile. You're about to include me in something illegal, aren't you? He said, furrowing his aged brow. I need you to be a lookout for me while I go and check out Meredith's place. Talico rolled his eyes before saying, "I suppose you want to go too." Ember looked behind her to where his gaze was focused. Kaylee was sitting on top of the dresser, grinning. "Are we going into battle?" Talico narrowed his eyes. "Well, that would depend on how quiet you manage to be. She is a dark witch, after all." Ember felt the same buzz of excitement she always got when she was about to go snooping. "Come on then, both of you. Let's go." The three of them apparated into Meredith's conservatory, once Talico had given them the all-clear. The appearance of the house was much like Meredith herself, dark, creepy, and an excellent place to hold a Halloween party. The lounge was large, with blood-red walls and a black sofa. There were several wall hangings which looked like they were of ancient rituals. "Let's go and check out the kitchen," Ember whispered to Kaylee. They made their way through the long lounge to an open door on the right which led to the kitchen. A large black aga dominated the room, but Ember saw the thin cupboard around to the right of the wall, which held jars of mislabeled cooking ingredients that were obviously spell components. Kaylee leapt onto the small kitchen table and stared into the cupboard. "Are they all poisons and potions she uses in her dark magic?" "Nope," said Ember. "I think they're mostly herbs used for cooking." "Oh, that's not very exciting, is it?" Ember looked at her and smiled. "Did you find anything interesting?" "A shrunken head," Kaylee stated very matter-of-factly. "A shrunken head?" Kaylee nodded. "Anyone we know?" Ember asked, grinning. "Looked a bit like Meredith, actually, but I think all the dark stuff she has is just for show or decoration, although she does have a few totems hanging by the door from thin wire." Kaylee pointed them out with her paw before jumping down to check out the small boot room area which led to the back garden. "Ember!" she called out. "Look!" Ember leaned down to see what Callie was pointing at. 2 dead rats. Callie nudged open the small shoe cupboard and found a box of rat poison. "Looks like Meredith is well equipped for a murder." Ember raised her eyebrows and continued searching the house. She saw a large oak desk at one end of a small room next to the kitchen. She gently shifted the paperwork around and found a party invitation. They were Meredith's. She was the one having the party. There was a picture on the front of the invitation depicting the Wicked Witch crushed under the house from The Wizard of Oz. The words across the top read, "Ding dong, the witch is dead." "What have you found?" Kaylee asked as she crept into the room. "Meredith appears to be throwing a party in celebration of Cassandra's recent demise." Kaylee looked at Ember and was about to reply when Talico appeared through the door. "Get out! Someone's coming!" The three of them make their way out the back door, but just as they were about to close it behind them, they heard someone shouting Meredith's name. Ember recognized the voice. They moved slowly and quietly around to the side of the house and peered around the wall at the front door. It was Ash. She was pounding on the door with her fist and shouting. "Who is it?" asked Kaylee when Ember pulled her head back behind the wall. "It's Ash." "What's she saying?" Ember's face dropped. "She's demanding to know if Meredith has told anyone anything." Neither Kaylee nor Talico said anything. They all simply looked at each other for a moment, until Talico suggested they leave. "Wait," said Ember. "I want to know if she says anything else." They waited a minute or two, but Ash gave up and left. Talico, Kaylee, and Ember apparated back to the pub. Talico disappeared in a dramatic puff of white smoke while Kali snuggled up on the armchair, and Ember got ready for bed. It had been a really long day, and she hadn't even had a chance to think about her wedding. Ember slipped under her fresh cotton sheets and picked up a bridal magazine from her side table. She read about 2 paragraphs on the importance of hiring a good photographer before falling asleep. The woman's face was like an old hag, glaring closely into Ember's eyes. Her hair was jet black with gray streaks, and her grimace revealed uneven, decaying teeth and a black tongue. Ember reeled in horror as she realized the woman was wearing a wedding dress, her wedding dress. The woman poked her in the chest with her bony finger and cackled something Ember couldn't understand. Then she saw it, the blood slowly soaking into the bodice of the dress, the stain expanding slowly, gaining in size, darkening in color. Ember tried to scream, but no sound came out. The old woman laughed at her and poked her again. A freezing shiver ran through Ember's body. She tried desperately to move away, to run, but her limbs were no longer under her control. The woman raised both arms and chanted something, then threw her arms towards Ember, who screamed. Ember woke up screaming and fighting with the sheets on her bed. As she opened her eyes, she saw the concerned faces of Kaylee and Talako standing over her. She attempted a smile to let them know she was fine, but her heart was racing and her entire body was covered in sweat. Chapter 13. Ember was still reeling from her dreams the next morning as she prepared to open the pub for the day. Sage had dropped by to check on her, and she and Talako were looking on with concern. Even Kaylee seemed more nervous than usual, and had on several occasions headbutted Ember's hand to encourage her to slow down and pet her for a while. Ember had to say that having her friends around was grounding. She felt less lonely and vulnerable than she had in her dreams. Still, she couldn't get Ash's behavior off her mind. Luckily, her friends were all happy to discuss Ash with her. So apparently she was in town longer than we knew, Sage offered, since evidently she was dropping by Meredith's place asking around about Cassandra. Together, Ember and Sage were wrapping up clean silverware sets in paper napkins. There was a pleasant sound of clinking silverware as they tucked together knives, forks, and spoons and folded the napkins tightly around them. Kaylee was curled up uncharacteristically on Ember's lap. Not to mention at some point she wrote a threatening letter, Ember said in a pained voice, to a woman who turns up dead the first time Ash steps back in town in years. It's not looking great, Kaylee admitted frankly. It's really strange. I'm usually an excellent judge of character, and I thought Ash was entirely on the level. She sounded like the thought that her judgment might have been incorrect deeply wounded her. Of course we don't have the full picture, Talako, always the diplomat, added. Every piece of evidence against Ash so far is circumstantial. So far there's nothing actually tying her to the scene. Maybe, Ember said. Then with a queasy feeling, she thought back to what she'd seen in Ash's room at the Fairy Tales Inn. It hadn't meant much to her at the time, but ever since she couldn't get it out of her mind. But there's something you don't know. Sage, Talako, and Kali all watched her curiously, waiting for her to explain. She was tempted to leave it there, because she didn't want to strengthen the case against Ash any more than it already had been. Even so, these were her friends. They'd known her a long time and they'd helped her solve a lot of mysteries. She trusted all of them innately, and she wasn't sure she could get through this upcoming week, with Ash, the case, and the wedding, and everything else that seemed to be happening all at once, without them by her side. Which meant she had probably better be totally honest with them. The wire that was used to strangle Cassandra, she began tentatively, still wondering if she should stop herself. Then, she sighed deeply, relenting. I saw some wire like that in Ash's room. I guess she uses it for making jewelry. Oh my goodness, she's carrying what's essentially the murder weapon with her, Sage cried. There was a clatter as she set aside a silverware set a little too heavily. So, in that case, she has motive, opportunity, and means. You sound pretty convinced, Ember said bleakly. Honestly, she had been hoping to hear that this wasn't the smoking gun evidence she feared it was. Sage's reaction made her feel miserable, even guilty. Sage looked ready to confirm Ash as the killer, but when she took a second look at Ember, she hesitated. Well, she muttered, I guess we shouldn't be hasty in drawing conclusions, but I'm sure Cedric is looking into the jewelry wire as an option. I'm sure he would be, but I haven't told him yet. Sage blinked at Ember for a few seconds as though she hadn't heard her properly. You haven't told him? Ember shrugged. I don't know. It's not like I've hidden it from him intentionally. I'm just not thinking straight here. It's tough to be objective about family, Talako agreed. Besides, it's not like there are 0 other suspects, Ember insisted. I mean, consider Rose. She was certainly motivated. And since she's a rat shifter, she might have sneaked in without much difficulty at all. Not to mention Meredith, Kaylee pointed out. Yes, Ember seized on this. She had wire and rat poison in her house, not to mention a whole pile of threatening letters in Cassandra's personal collection. Rat poison, Sage said thoughtfully. That's it. The smell from Meredith's house. The one I couldn't place. It was the smell of rat poison. She wrinkled her nose distastefully. I am, unfortunately, familiar with the scent. Talico floated until he was in front of Ember, looking kindly down at her. In his even, calming way, he said, "The wedding is coming up in 4 days. If you want something figured out, of course, we all believe in you. We've seen you solve more difficult cases than this, and although your sister's potential involvement is a hurdle to be overcome, I know you are capable of this if you just believe in your own abilities." Ember wiped away a tear she hadn't realized was there. "What should I do?" she asked. Talico smiled. "You should do what you do best. Talk to people. Ash, for her side of the story. Or Cedric, to get something done." Ember looked to Kaylee, who was peering up from her lap. "I agree with the ghost," Kaylee said firmly. "You've got this. You just have to move forward." When Ember looked at Sage, her best friend nodded without hesitation. "No matter how things look now, we don't know everything," Sage added. "We can only get the bigger picture if we keep looking and asking around." The trouble was, if Ash was responsible, Ember couldn't be sure she really wanted to know. But her friends were right. This was what she did best. And even if she didn't want to hear that Ash was a murderer, there would always be some part of her that wouldn't be able to trust her sister, unless she had a hand in figuring out what had really happened. "All right," she said finally. She wasn't sure who she was going to talk to, Ash or Cedric, but she was at least convinced that she needed to start with either one or the other. "I'm on it." Chapter 14. Unfortunately, Ember was scheduled to cover the early lunch hours at the pub by herself, before Tara came at noon to join her. And as soon as it was time to open, a few customers trickled in. Among them were Tom and Alice. "Hey there," Tom said as they entered, waving to both Ember and Sage. "We're here for an early lunch." "Breakfast," Alice insisted, clinging to her father's hand. Then, with an imploring look at Sage, she asked, "Do you have pancakes?" Sage smiled and looked at Ember, who shrugged. "Nope, I'm sure we could put together some pancakes for you if that's what you're hungry for," Sage said brightly. "Don't you have to go to your shop?" Ember asked her. Sage shook her head. "I'll be fine. I can hold down the fort here." Then, with a significant look at Ember, she said, "Wasn't there something you were about to go and do?" Honestly, Ember had been partially grateful for the excuse to stall. Of course, Sage could read Ember like a book, so she probably knew that perfectly well. And here she was, like a good best friend, giving her the nudge she needed. "Right, yeah," Ember said. "Well, I'll try to be back soon." "Take your time," Sage insisted. "Everything here will be just fine." Then Sage led Tom and Alice over to a nearby booth and waved Ember off. Ember meandered out to her car, the same question swirling through her head. Should she talk to Ash? Or Cedric? Talking to Ash might get her more answers, but she also couldn't ignore how angry Ash had been yesterday. Ember wasn't sure she wanted to face that again so soon. And talking to Cedric, well, she certainly didn't want to hide anything from him. She trusted him and his policing skills not to jump to conclusions. But she was worried that by indicating Ash possessed something that very well could be the murder weapon. Well, what if that, coupled with the letter and the visit to Meredith's house, was simply too much evidence for Cedric to ignore? She didn't make a decision so much as start driving. After a few blocks, she realized she was driving in the direction of the inn. Ash it was, then. Except that something occurred to her when she had gotten halfway there. If Tom and Alice were at the Broken Broom, then that meant their house was empty. Indeed, the house looked empty from the outside. Still, she was anxious as she prepared to poof inside. Sitting in her parked car, Ember took a deep breath and tried to imagine herself into the house. She spoke the words that should have teleported her there. Then she opened her eyes. She was still in the car. Confused, Ember reached out with her magic. She could feel a strange barrier around the house, a network of magical wards that acted like a thick carapace through which magic couldn't penetrate. Well, I guess Cassandra did have a lot of magical enemies, Ember reasoned to herself. Even so, considering Cassandra was dead, it was likely the spell had begun to degrade. Spells were usually drawn from the life force of the caster. Even if they outlived the witch who had put them in place, they weren't as strong without that initial pool of energy to fuel them. Again, she reached out with her magic, looking for fault lines and fractures. She found one without too much difficulty, and when she whispered the teleportation words, she found she was able to slip through. Not sure how long she had, Ember didn't waste any time looking around the house. She headed straight for Cassandra's office, where she assumed she would find the most incriminating materials. Even so, on the way, she spotted a few items of interest. Near the back door, evidently not yet packed away, were some camping and fishing supplies, including a bagged-up tent and some tackle boxes and poles. A quick look under the sink showed some boxes full of rat poison. In easy reach of a 5-year-old, Ember muttered disapprovingly. There weren't even child locks on the cabinet, but entering Cassandra's workroom was like stepping into a different world. Even the quality of the light changed, the sun filtering through dark lacy curtains and turning to a murky gray. The room was cluttered, and every object seemed to loom out of the near darkness toward Ember. And there was a feeling in here, thick and heady, that always accompanied dark magic, lingering like a bad scent. Ember didn't have to look at the books lining the shelves around the wall to know that they were bad news. The dark magic energy was stronger there than anywhere else in the room. Still, she drew near and glanced at the titles. Dark magic, blood magic, sacrifice. A shiver ran all the way down Ember's spine. She stepped away hastily. As she turned from the bookshelves, she glimpsed something sitting out on top of what must have been Cassandra's desk. It looked like a journal, and when she reached out to touch it, she felt the same wards that had been surrounding the house spring up. These wards were degraded too. Ember muttered a spell to dissipate them, enough at least that she could open the pages. Cassandra's writing was scrawled all over. Maybe if I can figure out more about the case sooner rather than later, I won't even have to talk to Ash or Cedric, Ember considered. Not until I know more. So she took the journal and poofed out of the house. Back in her car, Ember paged through the journal. In the last few pages, Cassandra seemed to be writing about several problems over the last week of her life. I'm missing all sorts of items and books from my house, not to mention how ill I've felt. Checked for curses and magic, of course, but can find nothing. Who can be responsible? Rose? Have purchased some poison in case she is the culprit. I know how to deal with a rat. Meredith? Huh. Of course there is Ash, who visited to tell me off. I suppose she broke that old spell and finally has her family back. No dark magic needed. She expects me to be impressed? She could have been a powerful dark witch, and instead she's chosen to sell trinkets. I plan to do a scrying spell when Tom and Alice go on their camping trip. With any luck, the spell will determine the cause of these troubles. And when I find the cause, I will deal with it. Chapter 15. What did Cassandra mean when she said she'd deal with the cause of her troubles? Ember guessed it would have been some dark and gruesome magic. At least she can't do anything about it now, Ember said aloud to the empty car. Journal in hand, Ember drove back to the broken Broom. She planned to talk with Tom about Cassandra's woes leading up to her untimely demise. Maybe he'd have a clue as to who was responsible. Ember entered the pub and was surprised to see that Rose had joined Tom and Alice. Ember could feel a charge in the air quite dissimilar from how things had been when she'd left. Tom hadn't been unhappy before, but he was still noticeably happier now that Rose was around. Ember smiled slyly as she watched the reunited family from the front door. Tom and Rose hung on each other's every word as if they had both hungered for this interaction for years. Alice and Kylie sat on the floor nearby, Alice playfully dangling a scrap of string above Kaylee's head. Kaylee's eyes were practically the size of dinner plates as she carefully planned her next leap for the coveted trash. "Hi, Rose. Nice to see you here," Ember greeted as she walked further into the restaurant. Ember's words sufficiently pulled Rose from her trance with Tom. "Oh, hi, Ember. It's lovely to see you too." She was reticent to tear Rose from her conversation with Tom, but Ember needed to get a feel for Rose alone. Cassandra had rat poison, and Rose was a rat shifter. Coincidence or not, it warranted investigation. Rose, Ember asked, do you think we could talk in private? Just for a second. Certainly, Rose replied as she stood up. She turned toward her ex-husband, grinning, and said, I'll be right back. Take your time. Tom waved off the two women and turned toward Alice and Kaylee. Now, Alice, I hope you're not torturing that poor kitty. Oh, she's fine, Ember called to him as she and Rose walked toward the back. Kaylee loves to play. What's up, Ember? Rose asked when the two entered the pub's storage room. She was being polite, but Ember sensed that Rose was guarding something. Ember stuttered as she searched for the words. I don't know how to say this, but I can't even begin to imagine losing the love of my life to someone else. And to lose a child, too. Tears began to well in Rose's eyes, and she quickly turned her head to wipe them away. The two stood together in silence for what felt to Ember like an eternity before Rose finally spoke up. I appreciate that, Ember. Rose smiled and set a reassuring hand on Ember's shoulder. She had noticeably softened. My life has been a whirlwind ever since Cassandra took Tom and Alice from me, and I would have done just about anything to get them back. Did you? Ember asked bluntly. I mean, do something? Rose let her hand fall back to her side and she turned her face toward the floor. I tried a lot of things, but Cassandra was too strong. Rose looked back up at Ember. She was a powerful witch with even stronger protection spells. Nothing I did could get through to her. Ember sensed that Rose was telling the truth. She'd seen plenty of evidence of Cassandra's power with her own eyes. Okay, Ember replied and reached for Rose's hand to give it an encouraging squeeze. I believe you. When the two women emerged back into the dining area, Callie and Alice were playing a new game. Now, Kaylee stood with her front paws splayed in front and her rear end high in the air as Alice quickly shuffled her hands around in front of the cat. Despite Kaylee's best efforts, she couldn't catch any of the tiny fingers. Come on, Alice, Tom said to his daughter as he slid out of the booth. I think we've had enough fun with the kitty for today. Aw, but Dad, Alice moaned. No buts, Missy, Tom scolded. We've got other errands to run today, remember? Alice moved at a glacier's pace as she started to rise, but Ember stepped in first. Actually, Tom, I had a quick question. Sure, shoot. Would there be any reason that Cassandra would have needed rat poison? Rose and Sage had started talking near the bar, so Rose fortunately didn't hear Ember's question. Tom looked shocked. Yeah, actually she did. Cassandra told me she'd had some rodents in her office, big ones, and apparently smart too. None of them so much as touched the poison. Did you ever find evidence of a nest or something? Ember asked. Nothing, Tom replied. They must have been sneaking inside from somewhere. Not to mention, I actually haven't seen any rats since Cassandra, you know. Ember groaned. Had Rose been genuine earlier, or was she a better actor than Ember thought? Ember glanced toward Rose and Sage, locking eyes with the latter. Ember and Sage couldn't communicate telepathically, but they might as well have. Sage could tell that Ember needed their guests out fast. Sage quickly pivoted her conversation with Rose. You know, I just remembered that I've got to get back to the shop. She started gently shoving Rose. And I know Ember's got a lot of work to do. I mean, the woman's getting married in 4 days. Busy, busy. Rose allowed herself to be pushed toward the front door, sensing that she was no longer wanted. Okay, well, I've got stuff to take care of today, too. Tom scooped up Alice, who had resumed playing with Kaylee when she noticed her father was distracted. We've got to go, too. Lots of errands. Tom practically ran to the door to hold it open for Rose, their daughter giggling as she bounced up and down in her father's arms. After you, Tom said genially to Rose. Thanks, Tom. Rose smiled and walked out. The three waved goodbye to Sage and Ember before letting the door slowly shut. Now that they had the pub to themselves, Sage turned to Ember. What was that about? She asked. Apparently, Cassandra had a rat problem. Oh, Sage replied, realizing the implications before she realized something else. Wait a minute. How do you know that? Ember blushed and turned away. Tom told me, duh. Sage walked over to Ember and looked her straight in the eyes. Why were you asking in the first place? Did you even go talk to your sister? No, but, Ember started to say before Sage cut her off. Nope, I don't want to hear it. You need to talk to your sister. And if you can't be trusted to go on your own, then I'm taking you to see her. Sage, I appreciate this, but really Ember was cut off again, this time by Talico appearing to her right. Talico, what's up? Ember asked the ghost. He didn't typically appear without reason. Talico responded solemnly. I've felt something malicious around town over the last few days, especially here. I didn't want to tell you for fear of ruining your upcoming nuptials, but the subject could no longer be avoided. I've yet to find the source, and I want you to be properly forewarned. Ember sighed. She had a guess who might be the source of that dark presence. Thanks, Talico. Ember turned back toward Sage. All right, I'll go talk to Ash. For real this time. Think you can watch the pub a little longer? Trusting Ember at her word, Sage replied, Absolutely. I'll always be here for you, Ember. Ember and Sage embraced before Ember left for the fairy tale inn. Chapter 16. Ember walked purposefully into the fairy tale inn. The warmth of Sage's embrace clung to her. Ember tried to draw strength from that warmth in preparation for confronting Ash. Luca flitted about, dusting the overhead lights. Luca spotted Ember and a grin sprang to her face. The fairy descended from the ceiling, wiping her hands on a stained cloth. Here comes the blushing bride, Luca said cheerily. Ember's half-hearted smile caused the sprite to frown. Uh-oh. I know that look. What look? Ember asked. The put-upon bride-to-be look, Luca replied. Wedding got you stressed, huh? Ember didn't want to speak of her suspicions regarding Ash. She nodded, letting Luca believe her assumption. You need coffee, Luca said. She muttered a spell, cast her hands forward, fingers outstretched. A glimmer of rainbow glitter spewed from her grasp. Ember found herself holding a mug of coffee warm to the perfect temperature. She took a few sips to be polite. The coffee tasted delicious, as always, but it did little to quiet Ember's nerves. Thank you, Luca. If you'll excuse me, I need to speak with my sister. Of course, hey, even if you're a little overwhelmed, I bet you're excited, right? I just know you and Cedric are going to be very happy together. Thank you, Luca, Ember replied. She set the half-full mug on the counter, and it vanished. That means a lot. If you need help with decorations, I'm your girl, Luca said. I can hang stuff without the need for a ladder. Thanks for the offer, I'll keep it in mind, Ember said, waving cheerily. She headed to Ash's room and paused in front of the door, tamping down her anxiety. I have to do this. It simply seemed so unfair. She'd only just gotten Ash back. That golden feeling had been smudged over by the pall of suspicion. Ember rapped her knuckles on the door and waited. Ash? Ember called. I'm not housekeeping. Ember hoped the jest would soften the blow of what was about to come. She dreaded having to confront her sister. Ember wouldn't let that stop her. Just a moment. A few seconds later, Ash opened the door, her ultramarine eyes bleary from sleep. Oh no, did I wake you? Just a cat nap, don't worry about it. Ash smiled and stepped back from the door, sweeping her arm in invitation. Ember entered the room and Ash shut the door. To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit? You look worried about something. Ember's throat felt too tight to speak. She swallowed hard, hands fidgeting at her sides. The awkward silence stretched out until she found the wherewithal to speak at last. Ash, Ember said, I know you visited Cassandra before her death. Ash flinched. Her jaw worked silently, but she neither confirmed nor denied Ember's accusation. Why did you do that? Ember's voice wavered, but she felt more confident as she went on. Her pent-up questions spilled forth in a rush. Why did you come to town early? Ember swallowed and took a step toward Ash. Did you kill Cassandra? Ember blurted. Ash sat down at the desk, looking off into the corner of the room. Ember rambled on, unable to bear any more silence. I have to tell Cedric about all of this. Ash glanced up at her, an inscrutable expression etched on her pale visage. Why haven't you already? She asked in a hollow tone. Because you're my sister, and I wanted to give you a chance to explain first. Ash pursed her lips and brushed her dark bangs out of her eyes. Yes, I came to town early because I wanted to confront Cassandra on what she'd done to me. But I didn't kill her. Ember wanted to believe that very much. You wanted her to take accountability for her role in what happened to you? Ember asked. Yes, she cost me 17 years of being without my family, made me question whether I really was destined to be an evil magic user. Ash laughed without mirth. I wanted to show Cassandra she was wrong. I wasn't evil. I got my family back and without having to sell my soul to darkness. Ash looked up at Ember, an intense light in her eyes. Killing Cassandra would have proven that I was as bad as she always said I was. Ash shook her head. That's why I couldn't do it. I will admit I've thought about it, lots of times over the past decade and a half. That's not me, though. That will never be me. Ember smiled, and it proved infectious. Ash returned her grin and chuckled softly. Besides, the real reason I came to town early was to make sure I was really ready to meet the sister I hadn't laid eyes on in 17 years. Ash sighed. I'm glad I went through with it. I'm glad you came back, Ash, Ember said. But I wish you'd come to me with your problems sooner, so I could have helped. Ember and Ash rose spontaneously and embraced in the center of the room. Ember sighed, warmed by the love she'd forgotten for so long. So, Ash said, pulling away first. Why have you been so focused on me? You saw the letters. Any number of people wanted Cassandra dead. That's true, Ember agreed. What if we went to Meredith's party tonight and did some investigating? Ash suggested. I'd really like to help clear my name. Ember smiled. I think that's a great idea. The sisters embraced again. Ash was right. There were any number of suspects, and Meredith's party would be the perfect place to begin whittling them down. Chapter 17. Ember glanced over at Ash as they strolled along the sidewalk toward the Kakamar police station. Her sister's inscrutable aquamarine gaze prompted a frown on Ember's lips. Are you sure you want to do this? Ember asked. Yes, I want to fully cooperate with the investigation, Ash replied firmly. Ember entered the station first, holding the door open for Ash. They swept through the lobby and headed over to Cedric's office. He sat at his desk, muscle-knotted arms tense as he supported his chin on his fists. His blue eyes bored into the twin stacks of hate mail on his desk. Hey, Ember said cheerfully, rapping her knuckles on his open office door. Cedric looked up, his grim expression vanishing. He stood up as Ember approached, throwing an arm around her waist as she pecked him on the cheek. She looked down at the mail on his desk. You seemed disturbed by something when we walked in. We? Cedric glanced up and noticed Ash was there for the first time. Hello, Ash. Hello, Sheriff, Ash replied. The fact she'd called him by his title rather than his name spoke volumes to Ember. Cedric gestured at the twin piles of mail on his desk. I've spent all day contacting every single person who sent Cassandra hate mail or otherwise had a grudge. Literally dozens of people. And? Ember prompted when he lapsed into silence. And it didn't amount to anything actionable. Everyone's got an alibi or have otherwise been ruled out. That must be frustrating, Ember said. Yeah, but that's not what's got me feeling so sour. Cedric heaved a sigh and cast a guilty-looking, blue-eyed gaze her way. I hate to speak ill of the dead. You know that. But quite frankly, Cassandra was a god-awful person. He lifted his gaze to stare right at Ash. I hate to say it, but my main suspects are Meredith, Rose, and you, Ash. Ash blinked rapidly, controlling herself quite well to Ember's estimation. Stay safe, both of you, Cedric said, embracing Ember warmly. I'll see you tomorrow. He gave her a quick kiss, and the sisters headed out of the police station. What now? Ash asked. Let's crash a party, Ember replied with a wink. I'm starting to regret this, Ember admitted as they moved toward Meredith's creepy swamp home. The buildup of repeated dark magic lingered in the air like an intangible pall. The worst that will happen is Meredith slams the door in our faces, Ash replied. Ember wrung her hands nervously as Ash rapped on the door. The dull hum of conversation, music, and occasional laughter wafted out into the night. The most boisterous laughter seemed to be that of Meredith herself. The door opened, and Ember was surprised to see it was not Meredith, but another witch who answered. The witch was a few years older than Ash, wearing dark eyeshadow and fishnet sleeves under her long t-shirt. The witch's eyes widened when they fell on Ash. Her lips spread into a grin. Ash? Is that you? Oh my God, it's been like forever. Nice to see you, Ursula, Ash replied. The women embraced, and Ember cleared her throat. Ash turned about and gestured at Ember. Ursula, do you remember my sister Ember? Oh, right, you own the broken broom, right? Ursula said, shaking Ember's hand. Nice to meet you. Come on in, please. Inside of Meredith's home, more than a dozen women alternately conversed, drank, or practiced incantations and charms. Despite it being a coven of dark witches, everyone seemed quite cheerful and intent on having a good time. Meredith herself had clearly partaken of the large punch bowl filled with Tom Collins. She staggered about to the different gaggles of women. Many were elders like herself, but Ember was surprised to see so many younger witches as part of the Dark Coven. The younger witches had something in common besides their age. They all seemed to know Ash. Her sister proved to be quite popular. Soon a knot of the younger witches formed around Ash, speaking a mile a minute. Ember edged closer to their conversation, hoping to catch a clue which might help her investigation. It's been great catching up with you again, Ash, Ursula said. Yeah, for real, Ash replied. She pointed toward Meredith, who cackled as she filled her cup with more booze from the punch bowl. Meredith sure seems to be having a good time. She should be, Ursula said with a twitch of her mouth. Meredith's got everything she wanted. Everything she wanted? Ember asked. Ursula's gaze narrowed suspiciously on Ember. What's it to you, bartender? Hey, that's my sister, Ash said smoothly. What did you mean Meredith got everything she wanted? Ursula's gaze softened as she turned it back on Ash. A while back, Meredith was the head of a different coven. Cassandra wanted her spot, and you know how Cassandra could be when she wanted something. Ember nodded, biting her tongue on adding to the conversation. Ursula was talking, and she didn't want to do anything to interrupt that. So Cassandra backstabbed and politicked her way to the top, kicking Meredith out for being too weak. Ursula glanced over at Meredith and licked her lips. Then, earlier tonight when she was just getting good and drunk, she said... Ursula's voice trailed off. Ash glanced over at Ember and then back to Ursula. She said what? Ash prompted. Meredith said she put a curse on Cassandra, Ursula said grimly. Then she said, now look who's in the powerful coven. It could just be the liquor talking, but, you know... Ember and Ash looked at each other. That sounded very incriminating indeed. Meredith had a penchant for the theatrical. That much was true. She also had a very compelling motive for wanting Cassandra dead. Chapter 18. Ember awoke the next day to a beautiful bouquet of ranunculus blossoms presented by Cedric. She smiled widely as she accepted the pastel diaphanous bouquet. What's the occasion? She asked, beaming a smile at the handsome sheriff. It's customary to give a girl flowers when you're taking her on a date, Cedric replied with a wry smile. Oh, we're going on a date? Ember laughed gently, brushing her fingers through the blooms. 3 days before our wedding? Color me impatient, Cedric replied. Besides, how long's it been since we had a date day all to ourselves? He slipped his powerful arms around her waist and pulled her in close. Cedric kissed her tenderly, then took her by the hand. They drove beneath the Spanish moss-strewn trees to the botanical gardens. Ember smiled at the pink-white magnolia blossoms forming an arch over the entryway. The day was temperate enough they rolled with the windows down. She inhaled the fragrant blossoms deeply, sighing as the lovely aroma crossed her palate. I love this place, she said with a sigh. I know, Cedric replied with a wink. He parked the car and hustled to open the door for her. He held onto her hand as they walked to the entrance. In his free hand swung a picnic basket, while a red and white checked tablecloth hung over his broad shoulder. Cedric's hand felt good in Ember's own. She squeezed it tighter and felt warmth spread through her breast. They walked the paths next to a placid, slowly meandering stream. A white swan floated on the surface, casting a mirrored image of itself when it moved into the sunlight. Ember paused to smell fragrant purple orchid blossoms, which grew along the path. A gentle breeze blew through the garden, enticing her nostrils with the sweet scents of blossoming flowers. Cedric tugged her on her arm and gestured to a weeping willow on the bank of the stream, its long fronds brushing the ground. That looks like a nice place for a picnic, he said. They moved off the path. Cedric's veined hand lifted a branch out of her path, as if he were parting a curtain or a waterfall. Ember stepped under the willow's branches and discovered a sun-dappled wonderland. A squirrel glanced over at her and reared up onto its haunches. It stared for a long moment until Cedric joined her under the branches, then bounded up into the tree. She lost sight of it among the higher branches. Cedric spread out the tablecloth and they seated themselves upon it. He laid down the basket and opened the flap. I hope you don't mind cold fried chicken and potato salad, Cedric said. It's kind of a traditional picnic fare in my family. Of course not, Ember replied. They dined under the sheltering boughs of the weeping willow, kept company by the buzz of bees and the merry songs of birds. Ember sat back and soaked in the quiet beauty while the chicken digested in her belly. Cedric wiped his hands clean and revealed another surprise, a bottle of white wine. He poured them each a glass, and they sipped under the shade of the willow. So you and Ash seem to be getting along fairly well, all things considered, Cedric began. Ember pursed her lips and sat up cross-legged. Yes, we have. It's been difficult, what with the missing 17 years, but we're working it out. She sighed, plucking at the grass peeking out from under the checkered cloth. Ember wrestled with her conscience, and finally decided to come clean about Ash's visit to Cassandra. There's something I need to tell you about Ash, Ember said. Oh? Cedric replied. His tone was casual, but his eyes burned with intense interest. She visited Cassandra before the murder, Ember said in a rush. Cedric's handsome face creased into a frown. Ember hastily continued before he could comment. You have to understand where Ash was coming from, though. She wasn't visiting Cassandra to cause trouble. Given their history, what other reason could she possibly have had for visiting Cassandra? Cedric asked. I think what Ash was looking for was closure, Ember replied, fidgeting with the grass blades she'd plucked from the ground. Cassandra had been instrumental in so much trauma. Ash wanted that final confrontation so she could prove to herself she'd well and truly moved on. Cedric's jaw worked silently as he set his empty wineglass down. He lifted his blue eyes to her, an inscrutable light dancing in their azure depths. I have a few other suspects besides Ash, he said at length. I keep running into the same problem with each of them, however. What's that? Ember asked. Cedric sighed. The thing is, everything I've found out about Cassandra suggests she was really powerful, not just magically, but politically in the community as well. Even though she had a lot of people who hated her, there were just as many out to curry her favor. Maybe so they wouldn't wind up one of her victims, I don't know. My point is, I don't see any of these other suspects having the courage to face someone as powerful as Cassandra and murder her. So you don't think any of these other suspects are guilty? Cedric shook his head. God knows I don't want Ash to be guilty, but she's still my strongest suspect. Just because she's your family doesn't mean she's not guilty. Ember sighed. I know. We'll just have to work extra hard and solve the case so we can clear her name. She lifted her gaze to him and grinned. Now, no more shop talk. You owe me the rest of a date day, Sheriff. Cedric laughed, and they spoke no more of the case. They instead concentrated on having a lovely day, a task which they succeeded at with utmost aplomb. Just before bed, Cedric had one final surprise. She came out of the bathroom after having brushed her teeth and found Cedric standing before her in a loud Hawaiian shirt and sunglasses, holding tickets to a Caribbean cruise in his hand. Guess where we're going on our honeymoon? Ember laughed and embraced him, feeling very lucky indeed. Chapter 19. Ember and Ash strode purposefully out of the fairy tale inn, a stiff wind lifting the afternoon's heat from the streets of Cauchemar. Ember glanced over at her sister, an anxious frown pursing her lips. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked. Confronting Meredith about her curse could stir up a lot of bad memories for you. Ash nodded, her lips a thin, tight line. Yes, I need to do this. I can't keep hiding from my past. I'm just glad I don't have to face it alone. They clasped hands tightly, Ash patting their conjoined grip with her free hand. Don't worry, Meredith's bark is way worse than her bite. She's never been that powerful of a witch. She does seem to try awfully hard to project a certain image, Ember agreed, with her taste in decor, living out in the swamp, even the way she walks. Exactly. Ash climbed behind the wheel of her rented Toyota Highlander and buckled her safety belt. Ember did the same on the passenger's side. Ash pulled out into the street and headed for Meredith's swampy home. Ash glanced over at Ember, a smile on her lips. So, how did your date day with Cedric go? Ember smiled, warmed by the memory. Wonderful. Cedric was as attentive and thoughtful as if we were on a first date. That's how you know he's a keeper, Ash said, when he's still working that hard and he's already got you roped into marrying him. We sort of roped each other, Ember said with a chuckle. Still, I really do feel like I got quite lucky. From what I understand, you two are like the dynamic duo around these parts. It would be weird if you two didn't get together after all you've been through. Ash turned off the highway onto the gravel road which meandered past Meredith's home. So, do you know where you're going for the honeymoon yet? Ash asked, a wry grin twisting her lips. Actually, yes. Cedric surprised me last night with tickets for a cruise to the Bahamas. Oh my God, that's priceless, Ash said, eyes shining. Honeymoon in paradise. Who could ask for more? I could ask to have this case solved before my wedding, Ember replied. Well, we'll see what we can get out of Meredith. Maybe that'll happen sooner than you think. Both sisters fell silent when Meredith's shanty came into view around a bend in the road. The skeletal, sinister trees draped their branches across the short driveway, as if forbidding their ingress. This wasn't here before, Ash murmured. It's not here now, Ember replied. She closed her eyes and saw the lines of magic running through the glamour. It's an illusion. An illusion? Ash squinted. Can you dispel it? Possibly, but there's no need. We can just drive through it. Ash sighed. I hope I get my deposit back on this truck. She eased her foot off the brake and they rolled forward. Ash squeezed her eyes shut and whimpered as the truck was set to contact the lowest branch. The image shimmered and vanished as the truck kept right on going. Ash opened her eyes and sighed. You were right. Just an illusion. She parked the Highlander and the sisters made their way across the scraggy yard to Meredith's front door. Ash rapped on the door firmly, then stood back and waited with her arms crossed over her chest. For several seconds, nothing happened. Ash prepared to knock again when they heard a thump, a rattle, and a curse. Heavy footsteps approached, then the door flew wide open. What do you want so blasted early? Meredith snarled, wizened face scrunched up as if in pain. It's afternoon, Ember said with a frown. Yeah? That's what I said. Meredith's gaze widened a bit, and she turned it between the two women. Oh, it's the Witchy Pooh sisters, Edgy Chick and the Goody Two-Shoes tavern maid who's always shoving her nose in other folks' business. That's not nice, Ember said. Ash took a step forward. We want to talk to you, Meredith. About what? Meredith snapped. I'm in no mood to entertain. Go away and leave me alone, or I'll cast a curse and spoil all your dairy products at home. Like you cast a curse on Cassandra? Ember asked. Yeah, Ash added with a firm nod. You cursed her and now she's dead. You said as much in front of more than a dozen witnesses, repeatedly. Meredith blanched, her angry glower fading before a fearful frown. I haven't told Cedric about this yet, Ember said. I wanted to give you a chance to talk first. Can't we come in for a moment? It's strange to stand here on your porch and talk about such things. Meredith snorted. She pulled the door open fully and turned her back on the sisters. Fine. Don't expect tea and cookies. Mind where you sit. I was clipping my toenails last night and a good-sized dagger sprang off into the wild blue yonder. Don't want to sit on that. Meredith cackled madly and settled into a battered recliner. You wanted to talk. Talk. We're not the ones who have anything to explain, Ash replied. Did you curse Cassandra or not? Oh, I cursed her all right, Meredith said. It just didn't work. You tried to kill Cassandra with a curse? Ember asked, aghast. No, Meredith said anxiously. No, I wouldn't do something like that. I'd be one of the first suspects. No kidding, Ash muttered. All I wanted to do was turn Cassandra green. You know, like the Wicked Witch in The Lizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz, Ash corrected. Yeah, that too. Meredith sighed. I thought I cast the curse correctly, but she never turned green. Do you have any proof? Ember asked. Anything I can show Cedric? Meredith rolled her eyes. She shuffled out of the room and disappeared for several seconds. When she returned, she tossed a careworn parchment page on the cup-ring-stained coffee table. Curse of the Swamp Hag. Nothing to cause permanent harm there. Either Cassandra figured out how to counter it or it didn't work. Ember took the parchment and nodded. Thank you for your time, Ms. Meredith, Ember said. She rose to her feet and after a moment, Ash did the same. Wait, Ash said when Ember was halfway through the door. She reached up and plucked at one of the totems hanging from Meredith's ceiling. What are you doing? Meredith blurted. Ash glared Meredith into silence, then finished taking down the totem. When they got outside, she explained her actions to Ember. Now we can compare this wire to the ligature marks, she said proudly. Good thinking, Ash, Ember said with a smile. We make a good team. Yep, Ash replied with a smile. Good witch and bad witch. Chapter 20. Ash pulled away from Meredith's house, gravel crunching under the tires. The sinister tree blockade illusion reappeared as soon as they passed the threshold of her driveway and the road. While Ash drove back to the highway, Ember examined the totem in her hands, focusing mainly on the wire used to hold it aloft. Was it a match for the ligature marks around Cassandra's throat? Meredith wasn't the most clever sort, but would even she be dumb enough to leave the murder weapon lying in plain sight? She shook her head, carefully bagging the totem and tucking it in the glove box. Ember glanced over at Ash. Her sister's face drew into a stark glower, eyes dancing with dark thoughts. What's wrong? Ember asked. Oh, nothing. Just, when you practice dark magic, it takes a toll on you. I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel sorry for Meredith. Me too, Ember nodded. I mean, I can't say I trust her or like her, but I do feel sorry for her. Where to next? Ash asked. If we're going to clear my name, we need to whittle down our list of suspects. Rose's house, Ember said. We'll confront her on what Tom said about the rat problem at Cassandra's place. And how it curiously ended right when Cassandra died, Ash said with a nod. They drove to Rose's house, finding the rat shifter ensconced in the well-kept garden behind her house. Rose knelt in the dirt beside a row of orange marigolds, yanking weeds out with her bare hands. She seemed very rodent-like in both posture and furtive activity. Rose noticed their approach. She turned her head toward them, pushing the brim of her sun hat up to see more clearly. "Hello there," she said. "What do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" Rose went back to her weeding. Ember cleared her throat and stepped forward. "Rose, we know that you were sneaking into Cassandra's house in your rat shape." "What?" Rose paused, leaning back on her haunches. She rested her gloved hands on her thighs and peered suspiciously up at Ember. "Who told you that?" "Tom says Cassandra had a terrible rat problem," Ash interjected. "That's why she was laying out poison and traps. Then, after she died, poof, no more rats." "Seems awfully suspicious," Ember replied. "So, what are you suggesting?" Rose stood up, blinking sweat out of her eyes. "That I skulked into Cassandra's house in my rat form, poisoned her, and then strangled her?" "Well, did you?" Ash asked. Her gaze snapped down to a spool of gardening wire on the ground. Ash picked it up and brandished it toward Rose. "This looks like a good match to the wire which was used to strangle Cassandra." "I can't believe you're accusing me of cold-blooded murder," Rose said, aghast. "That's not who I am." "But you were sneaking into Cassandra's house in your rat shape," Ember pressed. "It almost had to have been you." Rose sighed, staring at the dirt beneath her feet. "Yes, I was sneaking into Cassandra's place in my rat shape. That much is true. Maybe I even went out of my way to startle Cassandra now and again, but she stole my husband and child." "So that's why you shape-shifted and snuck into Cassandra's place?" Ash asked. "For petty revenge?" Rose glared at Ash darkly. "No, I was sneaking in to see my daughter. I didn't want April to forget her mother." Ember and Ash exchanged glances. The light in her sister's gaze echoed what Ember felt. Rose didn't seem so likely a suspect any longer. "Besides," Rose said, drawing their attention once more, "I can't believe you think I would stoop to using rat poison. Rat poison." Rose shifted her face into a hybrid rodent appearance, whiskers quivering. "Hello?" Rose sniffed and shifted back to her human appearance. "That's like dolphins murdering a porpoise with a tuna net." Ember frowned. "I know these questions make you uncomfortable, Rose, but you have to admit you had a lot of reasons to wish harm on Cassandra." "Me and half the darn town," Rose snapped. Her expression softened and she shuddered even though she stood in the hot sun. "Besides, I wouldn't have dared make a direct attack on Cassandra. She was a powerful witch." Ash and Ember exchanged glances. Ember nodded toward Rose. "Thank you for your time." They strolled off toward the truck. Ash pocketed the gardening wire as they bandied about possible suspects if Rose were to prove a false lead. "Rose was right about one thing," Ash said as they climbed into the truck. "What's that?" Ember asked. "There's no way a rat shifter could possibly take down a dark witch of Cassandra's caliber." "Come to think of it," Ember said, "Meredith really doesn't seem like she's powerful enough to take down Cassandra either." "Right," Ash replied. "I mean, if Meredith could have taken Cassandra, she would have done so when Cassandra kicked her out of her own coven." "Not only that, but Meredith lacks the wit," Ember said with a chuckle. "She's just not the sharpest rock in the box." "There's not a very long list of suspects who would pose a threat to Cassandra," Ember said. Ash nodded. "To be honest, I can't think of any of our current suspects who could have taken Cassandra in a fair fight. Or an unfair fight." Ember arched a brow at her sister as they pulled onto the road. "Does that include yourself?" "Oh, definitely," Ash replied with a laugh. "All other things considered, Cassandra could have taken me without breaking a sweat." "Well, we need to figure this out and soon," Ember said with a frown. "My wedding is in 2 days." "Don't worry, Ember. We'll figure it out before then. I recommend we return to headquarters and discuss strategy." "You mean head to the Broken Broom for beer and snacks, right?" Ember asked with a chuckle. "That too," Ash said with a grin. Chapter 21. Ash drove them back to the Broken Broom. The sisters bantered about the possible suspects but couldn't come to any sort of definitive conclusions. The Highlander rolled to a stop and the sisters disembarked. They headed inside the restaurant through the rear entrance. In the kitchen, they discovered Talako. The ghost hovered in the air, spectral eyes closed and face crossed with a look of serene concentration. Ember knew he meditated upon the unknown, sinister presence haunting town, so she left him be. As Ember warmed up meatloaf and apple pie, Ash poured them each a short glass of wine. "Did you believe Rose?" Ash asked. "I want to," Ember replied. "We know she's not strong enough to have taken Cassandra, but still we can't rule anyone out." The sound of the front doorbell jingling heralded the arrival of Tom and April. April's short, quick strides clumped across the floor as she giggled. "Kitty," she said, scooping a purring collie up in her arms. Tom smiled as he waved to the sisters. "Hi, thought we'd stop in for some lunch." "I was just warming up some meatloaf," Ember said. "Or would you prefer a menu?" "No, that sounds fine." He came over and seated himself on a stool while Ember went back to her work. Ash headed out to the lobby, where she occupied Alice and Kaylee by teasing the latter with a stuffed tuna on a string. "How have you been holding up?" Ember asked. "Things are looking up," Tom admitted as she set a plate of meatloaf before him, and a second, smaller one for Alice. "Rose and I have been spending a lot of time together, actually, which has been great for Alice." "You're getting along?" Ember asked as she laid down plates for herself and Ash. "Yeah, we are," Tom said with a nod. "Things have been great, really. I really don't know why we broke up in the first place. It's just weird." "Alice, come and eat," Ember called. She wasn't just concerned with Alice's nutritive needs. Ember needed Kaylee's help as she subtly questioned Tom. Alice came bounding over and clambered onto her stool. She upended a bottle of ketchup over her meatloaf, smothering it with a glaze of crimson. Kaylee leaped up onto the counter and settled in next to Ember's arm, his feline gaze locked firmly upon Tom. "So," Ember said, moving her fork around on the plate, "it almost sounds like your life is better now that Cassandra is gone." Tom stiffened slightly, pausing mid-chew. A moment later he swallowed, took a drink of iced tea, and sighed. "I know what you're thinking. It's not like that. I mean, I loved Cassandra. I never would have done anything to hurt her." He shifted in his stool, eyes beaming innocence at Ember. "I mean, don't get me wrong. I loved Cassandra, but some days she scared the living crap out of me. She could be a terrifying woman, even to the people she loved, you know?" Tom dropped his gaze to the child dining by his side and rested his hand on the back of her chair. "Meredith held court with some, questionable people. I am glad that they are no longer around to influence April. That much is for certain." Ember nodded and dabbed her mouth with a napkin. "Who wants apple pie?" April enthusiastically bounced up and down on her stool, shouting yes repeatedly. Ember retrieved the pie and cut everyone a slice, her mind lost in thought. Tom lived with Cassandra. Maybe that made him the perfect person to be her assassin. He'd seemed so sincere, however. They dug into the pie, all agreeing it was fantastic. Ember made a few notes, thinking she could have added a bit more egg wash to the crust. April and Tom departed, leaving the sisters alone with Kaylee. "Tom's lying," Kaylee said matter-of-factly. "What?" Ember blurted. "Are you sure?" "About what?" Ash asked. Kaylee turned a miffed cat expression toward Ember. "Yes, of course, I'm sure." "You're sure that he lied about loving Cassandra, or never being able to hurt her?" Ember asked. "I'm not certain of that either, or maybe even both." Ash and Ember exchanged glances. "We can't cross Tom off the list yet either," Ash said. "No, we can't," Ember replied. That night, Ember tossed and turned in her bed, tormented by heady, surreal dreams of portent. In her dream, she bore witness to a human-sized rose floating in her mind's eye. Unseen hands wrapped thin wire about the rose, crushing petals and causing them to flutter to the ground. The wire, much akin to that used to strangle Cassandra, cut into the stem, shearing off thorns and causing juices to flow. Rather than clear fluid, the rose oozed blood like a thing made of flesh. The wire slowly cocooned the rose, binding and crushing the petals down until it appeared a curved and tormented twig. The rose thrashed on the ground, writhing about as a living being in agony. Gradually, it arched backward, curving into a bracelet. Ember started when the rose burst into flames. A burning bracelet, she felt as if that should mean something. A sudden chill wind doused the fires, cooling the bracelet. It morphed once again, twisting into a green totem similar to the ones hanging from Meredith's ceiling. Ember's attention drew to a cackling emanating from the darkness. A green-skinned witch burst forth into view, face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a fairy tale enchantress. Dangling from her lip, a metal fishhook glittered as if with sinister purpose. Ember shrieked, sitting bolt upright in bed. Kaylee leaped down from her dresser and settled onto her lap. She stroked Kaylee's fur for a long time, laying back and trying to find sleep. The disturbing dream lingered in her mind, tormenting her long into the night. Chapter 22. The next day, Ember moved sluggishly through her morning routine. The disturbing dreams of the previous evening cast an intangible pall over her upcoming nuptials. I'm getting married tomorrow, and here I am obsessing over the case. But Ember struggled to decide what she should focus her attention on. On the one hand, there were still things to be done for her wedding. On the other, the mystery of Cassandra's death picked at her like a bluegill picking at a bait line. She sat sipping a cup of tea, staring out the window with Kaylee curled up in a sunbeam. Her fingers idly rubbed Kaylee's soft fur, while her mind wandered, lost in her own thoughts. Ember started when her phone rang. Her heart lifted a bit when she recognized it as Cedric's ringtone. "Hello there," she said, stifling a yawn. "Hello yourself," Cedric said. "How are you doing?" "Well, I'm feeling a bit anxious. Tomorrow is our wedding." "I know. Excited?" "Absolutely," Ember replied. "What's up?" "Well," Cedric heaved a sigh. "I wish I had better news. Forensics came back on those wire samples you and Ash gave us." "And?" Ember asked when he failed to elaborate. "I'm afraid neither of them is a match. The wire samples we have all left a residue behind. We didn't detect any traces of this residue on Cassandra's body." "That's a shame," Ember said with a sigh. "I did find something out that might help, though." "What's that?" Cedric asked. "Yesterday, Tom and April stopped by the Broom for lunch. I chatted up Tom and he said he loved Cassandra. Could never think of hurting her." "That sounds about par for the course," Cedric replied. "Yes, but Kaylee says he was lying." She heard Cedric's sharp intake of breath over the line. "I see. About which one?" "Both, possibly. Kaylee says it's not an exact science, more of an intuition. But she's certain Tom was lying about one or both of those things." "Well, far be it from me to argue with Kaylee's fine feline intuition," Cedric said with a chuckle. "So what do you think we should do?" "I reckon we should pay Tom a visit," Cedric replied. "I don't suppose if you know whether Sage is watching the kid today or not, do you?" "As a matter of fact, Sage is babysitting April." "Good. This could get uncomfortable, and I'd prefer not to do it in front of April. I'll come by and pick you up." Soon Ember headed out the front door and climbed into Cedric's patrol car. They drove out to see Tom, Ember growing more anxious as they went. She didn't want to believe Tom was capable of murder, but Kaylee's senses were never wrong. She resolved to reserve judgment until after she and Cedric had a chance to talk to Tom. Cedric parked the car and they made their way to where Tom stood in his garage, sweeping the concrete floor with a stiff broom. He paused at their approach, looking first to Ember, then narrowing his gaze on Cedric. "How's it going, Sheriff?" Tom said, ceasing his chore for the moment. "Miss Ember, you guys excited about the big day tomorrow?" "Yeah, we're plenty excited," Cedric said with a smile. He glanced around the garage. Ember knew what Cedric was thinking. The camping gear had been put away. "Say, Tom, when you took that camping trip the other day, the one you said happened on the spur of the moment, did you catch anything?" "I'm sorry?" Tom asked. Ember witnessed a bead of sweat run down Tom's temple. Guilty conscience, or just sweat earned through his labor? Fish. Did you catch any fish during your camping excursion? Tom's hands twisted on the broom handle. No. Sure didn't catch anything. That's too bad, Cedric replied, his fingers stroking his chin. Tom, would you consider yourself an accomplished fisherman? Well, I'm not bad, Tom said nervously. Not bad. Cedric strolled deeper into the garage, staring at a stuffed base on the wall. Look at that big fella right there. I bet he really fought hard. How much does a fish like this weigh? That one was almost 12 pounds. A 12-pounder, huh? Cedric whistled. That's a pretty good-sized fish. You must be at least mildly accomplished to have reeled him in. He was a fighter, all right, Tom replied. You weren't worried about the line breaking? Cedric asked, rubbing his fingers along the stuffed fish's scales. No, not at all, Tom said. It's a synthetic braided line. It would hold a person up, at least for a while. Tom's voice trailed off. He swallowed hard and looked anxiously at Cedric. How come you're asking all these questions, Sheriff? Oh, I've been thinking about taking up fishing as a hobby myself, Cedric said with a smile. Matter of fact, would you mind if I took a look at your rod? I'd love to see how an accomplished fisherman like yourself does things. No, Tom said, shaking his head. I mean, I'm in the middle of cleaning. I don't even know where I put it. Ember arched an eyebrow and stepped forward. Tom, were you ever afraid of Cassandra? Well, Tom cleared his throat. Sometimes, yeah. I mean, who wouldn't be? She could lose her temper sometimes. I mostly worried for April's sake. I mean, some of Cassandra's spell books were pretty violent, and April's wasn't even her daughter. Tom shook his head, rubbing his nose and seeming confused. Why did I even hook up with Cassandra in the first place? Seems like fishing wire is strong enough to do a lot of things, Cedric interjected. Tom covered his face with trembling hands. It took Ember a moment to realize he was sobbing. I just couldn't take it any longer, Tom blubbered. I mean, Alice might have gotten hurt. I did it. You did what, Tom? Cedric asked softly, a sympathetic frown on his handsome face. I killed Cassandra. Tom broke down into racking sobs. I strangled her, snuck up on her when she was casting a spell. Then I made it look like she hung herself. I'm so sorry. Ember watched, hand before her mouth, as Cedric cuffed Tom and put him in the back of his car. She hated to see Tom hauled away to jail, but at least Ash wasn't involved with Cassandra's death. Ember was grateful for that. Chapter 23. Ember awoke the next day feeling refreshed, if a little sad at Tom's arrest. With the mystery of Cassandra's murder having been solved, Ember no longer had to divide her attention. She focused fully on preparations for her impending nuptials, which were coming up in less than 24 hours. She thought back to her day date with Cedric, her breast filled with warm fuzzies. After tomorrow, they would get to spend every day together. Ember called the salon to make sure her hair and makeup appointments were still on schedule. An anxious and unnecessary gesture, perhaps, but Ember felt better for having done so. Cathy, the owner of Cathy's Corner Cafe, was dropping by later to help with food prep for both the rehearsal dinner and the wedding reception. Ember checked the dinner rolls she had proofing. She smiled at the domed towels over the pans. A perfect yeast reaction. Of course, she'd used a bit of magic to help it along. She did the calculations in her head as she checked stock, making sure she had enough on hand for both dinners. Kaylee jumped up onto the prep table and licked her paw. I think that covers everything, Ember said with a sigh of contentment. Did you make an appointment for your hair? Kaylee asked. Yes, I did, Ember replied. Do you have enough food to feed the army of people who are going to tramp around in here tonight? Yes, of course, and they're hardly going to tramp. Then yes, I think you've got it all figured out, Kaylee said. Unless you did something stupid and forgot to get the marriage license or something. Ember stopped dead in her tracks, her belly dropping into her feet. Oh no, she moaned. I haven't got it yet. Why not? Kaylee asked. Because it just slipped my mind. With the Cassandra case and Ash coming back to town and being a suspect, and the other preparations for the wedding, I just forgot. Is the courthouse still open? Kaylee asked. I certainly hope so, Ember cried. She grabbed her purse and dashed out to her car. The whole drive to the courthouse, she felt anxious, continually checking the time on her phone. She fervently hoped the courthouse would remain open. To her immense relief, the courthouse doors yielded to her pressure. Ember swept into the air-conditioned environs, heading for the reception desk. On her way, she paused, spying a familiar face sitting down and scribbling furiously on a clipboard. Rose. Rose looked up from her clipboard and smiled. Oh, hey. Fancy meeting you here. Well, I need to pick up a marriage license, Ember said. Right, the wedding is tomorrow, Rose said. Are you nervous? Of course a little, Ember replied. What's that you're filling out? Rose grinned and held the form out for her inspection. I'm trying to get custody of Alice back. With Tom being arrested, I'm trying to make it official to stay with me again. I'm sorry about what's happened, Ember said. Me too, Rose said with a sigh. Of course I'm sad that Tom got arrested, but I'm also proud of him. He put our daughter's safety above all else. He even broke through a love potion to do it. Ember nodded in sympathy. She noticed the line moving and parted ways with Rose. Later, the marriage license tucked into an envelope in her purse, Ember returned to the broken broom. She came in through the back door and found Cathy already hard at work on the food prep. Sage worked as well, alongside Alice. Ember felt a stab of pity for Alice. The little girl had been through a great deal of late. Perfect timing, Sage said as Ember donned an apron. Were you able to get the marriage license? Yes, thank goodness, Ember replied. I can't believe I forgot it until the last minute. I can, Cathy piped in. If I were about to marry the handsome sheriff, I'd be pretty flustered myself. Have you decided on where to go for the honeymoon? As a matter of fact, we're going on a cruise, Ember said happily. Where to? The Bahamas. That's fantastic, Cathy said. She turned her attention to Alice. Here, sweetie, you need more flour on your hands. The dough is starting to stick, see? Sage glanced over at Ember. You seem distracted. Ember thought back to meeting Rose at the courthouse. She considered Rose's declaration to get custody of Alice for herself. Ember decided not to bring it up right then. I'm fine, Ember said. Just a little anxious is all. If you need to get a little bridezilla on us, we'll understand, Sage said. Oh, hush, I'm not going to go bridezilla. Ember's phone rang. She recognized Cedric's ringtone and hastily wiped her flour-covered hands off on her apron. Ember extracted her phone and answered. Hey, Cedric said. Hey yourself, Ember replied. Are you still at work? Yes, he said regretfully. I'm going to be tied up for a couple more hours, but I'll be along after that. Sorry I can't help with dinner. No worries, I've got lots of helping hands, Ember replied. That's good, Cedric said. I've got to finish up, then I'll be on my way. I just wanted to say thanks for all your help with the case. That, and I'm glad I didn't have to arrest my future sister-in-law. Ember laughed and ended the call, returning to bury her hands in flour-covered dough with a smile on her lips. Chapter 24. Ember blinked sweat out of her eyes as she withdrew a pan of golden brown muffins from the oven. She placed the pan on the stovetop and slipped out of her oven mitts. When Ember pressed her finger into the center of the brown mass and released, the muffins sprang back up to their original shape. Beaming a smile, she turned about to check on the beets roasting in the oven. Behind her, Cathy finished up the dough Alice had been working over. Did your work crew abandon you? Ember asked as she straightened up and wiped the sweat from her brow. Yes, Cathy said with a chuckle. It's all right, though. Alice and Sage decided to play hide and seek. You know how short kids' attention spans can be these days. I used to love cooking when I was her age, Ember replied. Here, Let me give you a hand with that. As they worked, Ash entered the kitchen. Ember looked up, mouth gaping open. Ash, she said, quickly wiping her hands. It's so good to see you. Likewise, Ash said. Cathy looked between the two sisters and pursed her lips. Excuse me, I need to make a phone call, Cathy said. Ember knew Cathy was just giving her and Ash privacy to talk. Cathy filtered out of the kitchen. The two sisters stared at each other for a long moment, until Ember couldn't bear the silence any longer. So, she tried to smile. It's been a crazy couple days, huh? Yeah, you could say that, Ash replied dryly. I mean, I come back to town for the first time in almost 2 decades to meet the sister who'd been mind-wiped of my very existence, and she accuses me of murder. Ember sighed. I'm sorry, I was just following the clues, Ash. No, I'm sorry, Ash said, rubbing the bridge of her nose. That was uncalled for. After all, I'm not much more than a stranger. I've been out of your life, heck, I've been out of your mind, for 17 years. I can't expect unwavering trust, especially not after I went to see the murder victim soon before her death. Still, I could have shown more faith in you, Ember said, taking Ash's hand in her own. You're my sister, after all. Blood is thicker than water and all that, Ash replied, squeezing her hand back. Alice? Sage entered the kitchen, her eyes scanning about, ears twitching as she went. Alice? Ha ha, you got me really good. I can't find you anywhere. Alice? The sisters watched Sage head back out onto the tavern floor. Ember sighed. Poor Alice. She's the one who's the real victim in all of this. I couldn't agree more, Ash replied. She looked over toward the tavern floor, presumably where Alice and Sage played their game of hide-and-seek. Quite frankly, I'm glad Cassandra's dead. Ember gasped. Ash looked Ember in the eyes and gave her a half-smile. I know. Sounds terrible, doesn't it? I feel awful, but quite frankly, I can't help it. I'm glad she's dead. The world is a better place without Cassandra in it. I wish it hadn't ended with her father in jail. Ember said, but I'm glad Alice is free from Cassandra's influence too. Yeah, the town is safe from her influence now too. Ash glanced out toward the tavern floor. Sage's voice had grown more frantic. Alice, Sage called out. Alice, you win, okay? You win. You're the all-time hide-and-seek champion of the world. Now please come out. Please? You're scaring me. Sage entered the kitchen, her face drawn with worry. Have either of you seen Alice? I haven't seen her for a while now, Ember replied. Not since she stopped helping Cathy and I with dinner prep. I haven't seen her at all since I got here, Ash said. Oh no, Sage cried. I think she's really missing. Have you looked all over? Of course. There's only so many places to hide in this tavern. Calm down, Ember said. Let's split up and see if we can't find her. The three of them searched for Alice high and low, calling her name constantly. Ember made certain to search places a child might hide, like narrow ventilation ducts and up on the roof. Soon they had to conclude Alice was not on the premises. Oh no, Sage cried. Did she get kidnapped? Ember thought instantly of Rose at the courthouse, filing for custody of Alice. Let me call Cedric, Ember said, quickly digging out her phone. He picked up on the third ring. Yes, dear? Cedric, she said, her tone cluing him into the serious nature of her call. We can't find Alice. She was here in the Broom, and now she's gone. Understood, Cedric said, his voice switching to sheriff mode. Has anyone else been in the tavern? Not that I know of. Well, Tom is in custody, Cedric said. Ember took a deep breath and took the plunge. Cedric, I saw Rose at the courthouse yesterday, filing paperwork for custody of Alice. You don't think she could have... Impossible, Cedric said firmly. Why is that? Because Rose is here at the station visiting Tom. Has been for quite some time. Keep looking for Alice. I'll see what I can do to put the word out here. Okay, thank you. Ember hung up and shook her head. Our prime kidnapping suspect has an alibi. Cedric says we should keep looking for her. But we've looked everywhere, Sage moaned. A low, undulating wail interrupted their conversation. They turned their eyes to the center of the kitchen, where Talako struggled to manifest. His voice grew stronger, along with his outline, as he forced his way fully onto their plane of existence. Talako? Ember approached him. You look terrible. What's wrong? It's Cassandra, he said weakly. Talako seemed drained, exhausted. What about her? It's worse than we feared, Talako said. Cassandra has become a wraith, and she has taken Alice. Chapter 25. Ash veered the Highlander around a bend in the road, tires screeching as they sped toward Tom's house. Ember's heartbeat thudded like thunder in her ears. The thought of poor, sweet Alice in the clutches of a monstrous, undead dark witch was more than she could bear. Slow down, Sage called from the back seat. We can't save Alice if we slide into a ditch. Is Cedric going to meet us there? Ash asked, either not having heard Sage or out and out ignoring her. Yes, in fact, he might beat us there, Ember replied. They came upon Tom's house. Cedric's car sat out front, the driver's side door open. Ember felt a wave of panic until she spotted Cedric standing on the sidewalk. He strode out to meet them as Ash parked the truck. So far, the place looks deserted, Cedric said after he and Ember shared a quick embrace. Talako said Cassandra's wraith manifested here. We have to keep looking. Cedric nodded. He walked up the sidewalk and opened the screen door. Cedric tried the main door, but it wouldn't budge. It's locked. There's a key hidden in a false rock in the flower bed, Sage said helpfully. Alice told me about it. Ember bent over and peered intently in the flower bed until she spotted the likely culprit. She lifted the smooth stone from the dirt and discovered a panel on the back. Ember extracted the spare key from inside the faux stone and handed it to Cedric. Cedric opened the front door but didn't immediately go inside. Sheriff's Department, he called. Hearing no response, Cedric drew his service pistol and a flashlight. He moved in carefully, shining the light over the darkened house. Ember followed, staring about and calling Alice's name. Ash brought up the rear. Sage chose to remain outside, keeping watch. The three of them searched Tom's house high and low, but found no sign of Alice. Neither did they encounter Cassandra's wraith, though Ember felt a general dark unease lingering about the place. They exited through the front door, Cedric visibly frustrated. Ember gestured at the woods behind Tom's house. Should we check back there? That's a good idea, Sage said. Alice liked to play in the woods. I'm going to stretch my wings, get an aerial view. All right, be careful, Sage, Ember said. Sage spread her arms wide, then sprang into the air, becoming a bat in a split second. She fluttered into the darkening woods as Ember, Ash, and Cedric followed on foot. Ember turned toward Ash. How much do you know about wraiths? They're a particularly powerful form of apparition, Ash replied. Like Talako, wraiths are souls of the departed who linger on the material plane. Unlike Talako, they're able to manifest and affect the physical world with much greater frequency. How do you stop them? Cedric asked. That's the tricky part, Ash said. No one I ever talked to knew for sure. Apparently, wraith have a sense of unfinished business. Something keeps them from moving on, and they just won't, or can't, accept the fact they're dead. So, an evil ghost on a mission who won't accept death, Cedric said. Great, no problem. Ember frowned. Facing incorporeal entities is tricky. Hurting them isn't nearly as easy as warding or protecting against them. Hold up, Ash said. She held her hand out and grasped both Cedric and Ember's arms. Look up ahead. Ember saw why Ash kept her tone low. In the woods ahead, the trees parted in a large clearing. In the center of the clearing, she saw something which chilled her to the bone. Alice laying still and unmoving as death in the center of a sorcerous dark magic pentagram. Ember cringed inwardly at the thought of poor, innocent Alice in the midst of such a terrible sigil. Cedric moved forward swiftly, gun drawn. Ember and Ash followed close behind. A screech above heralded the arrival of Sage. The bat-shifter darted out of the treetops and dove toward the prone girl. She shifted into human form and landed adroitly a few feet away. Sage had but to take a few steps and lay hands on Alice. Before she could, however, an oily black smoke billowed from the border of the pentagram. It loomed up before Sage, causing the bat-shifter to rapidly backpedal. She retreated to the edge of the clearing, joining Ember and the others. "Is that Cassandra?" Cedric asked. The wall of smoke resolved itself into a roughly humanoid figure. Cassandra's face and flowing hair were in evidence, but seemed composed of shadow stuff rather than flesh and blood. Her form continuously flickered, as if winking in and out of existence 100 times per second. It made following the wraith's movements difficult on the eye. "That's Cassandra's wraith," Ember corrected. "If we want to save Alice, we have to get past it. Somehow." Cedric lifted his gun and grunted. "I doubt this is going to work, but—" Cedric carefully aimed and fired one round. The smoke stuff of the wraith seemed hardly disturbed by the steel-jacketed round as it went right through Cassandra and wedged into a nearby tree. "You might have more success with your wolf form," Ember cried. "Everyone spread out. Give her multiple targets to focus on." The trio fanned out. Cedric growled, then dropped to all fours in his wolf form. He loped around Cassandra the wraith's left flank while Ember moved in on the right. Cassandra's shadow form wailed, its mouth distending impossibly wide. It lunged for Ember. It seemed to Ember as if that ebony maw would devour her utterly. Cedric appeared, bursting through the center of the wraith's smoke stuff. He landed between Ember and the wraith, canine maw peeled back in a toothy snarl. "Look," Ash cried. The wraith seemed to struggle with the hole Cedric made in its center. It seemed weaker, its face twisted in pain rather than malice. As Ember watched, the wraith's center healed, but slowly. Somehow Cedric's wolf form had been able to hurt Cassandra. Ember's instincts had been right. Cassandra's miserable face twisted into a sneering smile. The wraith turned less substantial, became more mist-like than humanoid. It swept toward Cedric, flowing into his ears, his nose and mouth, even his eyes. "What's it doing to him?" Sage cried. "It's possessing him," Ember said, the awful truth dawning in her mind. Cedric's hijacked wolf form spun about on them, his snarling maw wide open. Ember shuddered when she saw Cedric's eyes. They were black as midnight, each containing a grinning face which resembled Cassandra's furious visage. Cedric growled and took a step closer. Chapter 26. "Sage!" Ember called over Cedric, snarling. "Go check on Alice, quickly!" Sage looked toward Ember with worry. "What about you?" "I'll be fine," Ember called. She spotted a tree stump and circled away from Cedric, trying to put the barrier between herself and his wolf form. She didn't want to hurt Cedric, but saw no way to strike at the wraith without also striking him. Ember's normally sharp mind floundered in the face of her conundrum. Sage circled around the snarling wolf and headed toward Alice's eerily still form. Sage grunted as she stepped into the pentagram and knelt beside Alice. She lifted the girl's head and put it on her lap. "Alice, can you hear me?" she asked. Cedric's wolf maw opened, and a bubbling dark laughter emanated from within. It was an unholy, unnatural sound. The wraith, displaying its mirth at their pathetic attempts to thwart its plans. Cedric's wolf form lunged for Ember. She thought at the last moment of a binding spell, but had no time to cast it. Cedric's jaws snapped open wide, looming close to her throat. Ash threw herself into Cedric's path. The wraith adjusted its aim for Ash's slender forearm instead. To Ember's surprise, and certainly the wraith's, it impacted into a translucent shield spell. Deadly maw deflected. The wraith fell back, nearly losing its four-legged footing. Ash went sprawling flat on her back, groaning in pain as she came down hard. During her temporary respite from the melee, Ember checked on Sage's progress. The bat-shifter glanced over at Ember with a worried frown etched on her face. "She's still breathing, but she won't wake up. I can't find any evidence of an injury either. Keep trying, Ember cried. The wraith had recovered its balance and now launched Cedric's wolf form at her again. Ember threw herself to the ground as the shaggy beast sailed overhead. She scrambled to her feet, struggling to summon up enough wherewithal to cast the binding spell. Ember couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if something went wrong. What if her magic hurt Cedric? How could she ever live with herself if that happened? The spell fizzled in her mind as Cedric came at her yet again. Ash ran in and shoulder-blocked the wraith, leading with her shield. The wraith stumbled a few feet but didn't go down. Ash was not so lucky, sprawling face first in the dirt. "Ember, you have to fight back," Ash cried. "Cedric would understand that you have to get rid of the danger." Ash turned toward Cedric's wolf form, its eyes black as midnight with the possessing wraith grinning in their dark abyss. She chanted a spell and threw her hands out toward the wraith as if casting a net. A circle of fire sprang up in the air, lighting up the darkening woods. It settled in a nimbus around Cedric's wolf form, hemming it in. The wrath snapped and whined at the barrier, growling in frustrated, savage fury. Ash stood with her arms straight out at her sides, lips moving as she chanted to keep the barrier going. The wraith continued to snap at the fiery barrier. Ember saw its onyx eyes narrow with crafty cunning. "Look out, Ash, she's about to try something." The wraith opened its stolen wolf maw. Oily black shadow stuff issued forth, spewing onto the circle of flame. The wolf swung its hairy head side to side, extinguishing a wide swath of the fiery barrier. "No!" shouted Ember as the wraith leaped for Ash. The great wolf tackled Ash, knocking her to the dirt. Its huge paws pinned her to the ground, snapping maw open wide to tear out her throat. Ember closed her hand into a fist and thrust it out toward the wraith while chanting a spell. The magic followed her arm's motion, sending a spectral fist to knock Cedric's possessed wolf form away from her sister. "Ash?" Ember moved over to Ash and knelt beside her. Ash laid still, her eyes closed. Before Ember could check to see if Ash still breathed, Cedric's wolf form came snapping at her once again. She threw up a shield spell and deflected the wraith's attack while backpedaling across the clearing. Ember wanted to put some distance between the wraith and her particularly vulnerable sister. She desperately wanted to check on Ash, but the wraith had to be dealt with first. "I'm sorry, Cedric," Ember said, summoning the binding spell to her mind. She cast her fingers toward Cedric as she chanted. A line of magical threads shot forth from her fingertips, spewing forth like silk from an inchworm's spinneret. The strands enveloped Cedric's wolf form, cocooning him in mere seconds. The wraith howled, snapped, and thrashed, straining at the magical bindings to no avail. Ember pointed her fingers toward the ground and chanted the final litany of the charm. The strands which ensnared Cedric's wraith-possessed form shot out tendrils toward the ground. The tendrils snared tree roots, half-submerged stones, even stabbed into the dark earth. They dragged Cedric's wolf form firmly to the ground. The wraith fought ferociously using Cedric's form. It reared up again and again against the magical tendrils. Ember winced every time Cedric's body was slammed to the ground, but she kept her concentration firm. Yes. At last, the wraith struggled to rise from the ground but could not defeat the tendrils. It dropped down heavily, letting out an otherworldly howl of frustration and malice. Ember had trapped Cedric's wolf form, and therefore the wraith, for now. Chapter 27. Ember stood looking down at Cedric's wolf form, ensnared in her magical binding. Even though its midnight black eyes glowed with malice and the frustrated screaming wraith trapped within, Ember felt compelled to apologize to her husband-to-be. "Cedric, if you're in there somewhere, I'm sorry," she said. The wraith took exception to this, struggling with a renewed ferocity to tear itself free from the magical binding strands. It thrashed about, raising its belly several inches off the ground. Its trembling limbs soon gave out and it flopped back to the earth with an agonized whimper. Ember kept a sidelong glance on the captured wraith as she edged her way over toward Ash. She knelt beside Ash and checked her over. To her relief, her sister breathed still. "Ash, are you okay?" Ember asked. Ash's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Ember. "Yeah," she said, sitting up with Ember's assistance. Ash winced when Ember went to take her arm. Ouch. Ash clambered to her feet with Ember's help. She held her arm limply at her side, gripping it with the other. Ember checked on the snarling, snapping wraith. Its black eyes glared at her from Cedric's wolfish face. She stared right back, squeezing her fist and tightening the magical strands just a bit more for emphasis. Ash staggered over to where Sage knelt with Alice. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the pentagram. "What is it?" Ember asked. "What was she trying to do to Alice?" "It's a very specialized type of dark magic," Ash replied. Her eyes narrowed to slits. The darkest kind, in fact, meant to drain life from that which lives and siphon it into that which does not. "Wait," Sage said, looking between the still Alice and the captured wraith inside Cedric's possessed body. "Are you saying that Cassandra's wraith was trying to sacrifice Alice so she could come back to life?" "Yes," Ash replied grimly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. If we let this continue, the spell will slowly drain Alice's life force. When she's fully drained, Cassandra will return as a living witch, one with full knowledge of the spirit world." Ember stared at the pentagram and shook her head. "I don't know how to break this type of enchantment," she said in lament. "I've never encountered anything like it either," Sage said. "I have," Ash said. "I can break it." "Are you sure, Ash?" Ember asked, her voice brimming with concern. "Yeah, I've studied dark magic for a long time," Ash said with a firm nod. "I can do it." "Okay, just be careful," Ember said. "You're pretty banged up." Ash turned a smile her way. "Don't worry, sis. I've got this." Ash stared at the glowing pentagram, her lips moving in soft incantation. She moved her good hand in a pattern, tracing an inverse pentagram in the air. Each line which Ash traced in the air erased a line from beneath Alice's body. The wraith howled and spit, giving one last fruitless go at freeing itself from Ember's binding spell. Ash continued to trace her pentagram. When she completed the pattern in the air, the pentagram beneath Alice vanished altogether. "That's the end of that," Ash snapped. She brought her hand down through the pentagram, which shattered into mist. The mist coalesced in the air and swept into the mouth and nostrils of the sleeping Alice. The wraith let out a long, unearthly moan. Oily smoke billowed from Cedric's pointed ears and wide-open maw. The wraith coalesced into its more familiar humanoid configuration. Cassandra's unholy visage appeared more exhausted than enraged. The smoke seemed to spill and melt off her form and run along the ground almost like water. It seemed to take a concerted effort for the wraith just to hold herself together. "Cedric!" Ember gasped, dismissing her binding spell and falling to her knees beside him. Cedric revered to his human form, wincing up at Ember with a smile. "Oh, my darling, are you all right?" "I'm all right now," he said. "Thanks to you. You did the right thing taking me down when I was possessed by Cassandra's wraith. If anything had happened to you, I don't know what I would have done," Ember said tearfully. She took his hand in both of her own and squeezed it tightly. Cassandra's wraith howled, gathering itself up for another assault. Ash sneered, moving her good hand in a series of arcane gestures. "Not this time," Ash muttered. "You just leave the happy couple alone." Ash finished her spell and the wraith slammed into an invisible barrier. Its smoky form filled the outlines of the unseen box. It pounded its incorporeal fists against the barrier in panic. Ash squeezed her hand shut, causing the box to retract in size. Cassandra's wraith compressed inside, until her form became an indistinct, inky black cloud billowing about madly inside the magical box. "I'll get Alice away from here," Sage said, lifting the girl's body in her arms. Sage fled toward the house, casting one last glance back at the box containing Cassandra's wraith. Ember glanced up as she heard a familiar groan. Talako manifested himself, seeming weak and diminished, but smiling. "Talako?" Ember stood up and went to him. "We were worried about you." "And I was worried about you," Talako replied. He stared over at Cassandra's wraith, straining to free itself from the box. Unfortunately, Cassandra's wraith will not stop trying to get to Alice. The poor girl will never be safe. What can we do about that? Ember asked. There must be something we can do, some way to deal with the wraith. Talico smiled sadly. He sighed as he gazed upon Ember. There is. She needs to cross over. He glanced at the boxed wraith and shook his head. Some spirits need help. Talico turned back to Ember. His smile returned. Ember, words can't express how proud I am of you right now. I'm so happy that you were able to find Ash. Talico? Ash said. Why are you talking like that? Why, talking like what? Talico asked innocently. Like we're not going to see you again, Ember said softly. Ever. Talico smiled at Ember. He moved in and offered a ghostly hug. Then he stepped over before the boxed wraith and nodded at Ash. Release your spell. What? Ash sputtered. Have you lost your ghostly mind? Trust me, Talico replied softly. Ash looked to Ember. Sniffling, Ember nodded her assent. Ash dropped the spell. The wraith expanded rapidly into her humanoid form, glaring darkly at Talico. I'll see you get where you belong, Talico said. Ember thought it sounded like a threat. The wraith spat at Talico. He grinned and took her shadowy hand. Ember threw an arm over her eyes as Talico and the wraith were enveloped in a blindingly bright glow. When it faded and she could safely look again, both the wraith and Talico had vanished. Chapter 28. Ember's tears fell softly, running down her cheeks in glistening rivulets as the trees sighed in a gentle breeze. Now that Cassandra's wraith had vanished, perhaps crossed over as Talico had said, the woods no longer bore the same sinister mood. Ember felt a kind of peace descend back on the world, as if it sighed in relief to be rid of the unworldly invader and its dark magic. Ember wept for Talico even as she helped Cedric to sit up. He winced and groaned, holding his side. Where does it hurt? Ember asked, her brow knit with concern. Where doesn't it hurt? Cedric tried to laugh, wound up holding his side instead. Ember pushed up his shirt and probed his ribcage with her fingers. She felt some swelling along his side, but there was no give of broken ribs. I wonder where they went? Cedric asked, pointing at the spot where Talico and Cassandra's wraith had vanished in a blinding flash of light. I don't know, Ash replied. She turned a fierce grin on both of them. I'll tell you what I do know, though. What's that? Cedric asked. Ash chuckled softly. I know I'm positively starving and have a rehearsal dinner to get to. Ash, Ember said admonishingly. What? Ash replied with a shrug. She winced and grasped her injured arm. That's what, Ember said, waggling her finger. Hospital first? Then we'll see about any silly rehearsal dinners. Your rehearsal dinner is most emphatically not silly, little sister, Ash replied wryly. And besides, I've got this covered. Ash stared at her arm and chanted arcane words. Her fingers waggled in the air along her limb, and a glowing splint appeared out of thin air, wrapping around Ash's injured arm. Ash lifted her arm with some pain but was able to do so without gasping and letting it drop back to her side as before. Ember shook her head, deciding against arguing with Ash for the time being. She turned her attention back on Cedric. Can you stand? She asked. I think so. With her assistance, Cedric regained his feet. Ash and Ember each supported one of his arms over their shoulders. They moved him back to his squad car. When he tried to slide into the driver's seat, Ember put her foot down. Mister, you get right over in the passenger seat, Ember said. I'm driving. Ash, where are you going? To drive the truck, Ash replied. Her lips twisted into a wry grin. It's a rental. I'm not going to lose my deposit. But your arm? I'll be fine. See you back at the Broom. They drove separately back to the broken Broom. Cedric had recovered somewhat when they finally pulled up outside, but still walked slowly and with a limp. What happened? Cathy asked as soon as they entered. We were getting worried, Ember explained as they bandaged Cedric up. His shifter metabolism had already begun the healing process. Ember and Ash wove a few enchantments to help him recover, then turned their attention to Ash's arm. It doesn't seem to be broken, Ember said, staring at Ash's arm with magically enhanced vision. I think it's just a sprain. We'll whip up some healing tea with dinner. I'll be right as rain tomorrow. The rehearsal was thrown off by the battle against Cassandra's wraith, not to mention Cedric's injuries. The party dove into the dinner, plating up and eating. Ember and Ash lingered near the end of the line by themselves, speaking softly. Kaylee sat on Ember's shoulder, her ears dropping, eyes cast downward. This place just doesn't seem the same without Talico, Ember said with a sigh. I miss him already. I know, Ash said with a sigh. I miss him too. Any minute now I expect him to just appear and start talking again, you know? Yeah, Kaylee said with a sigh. It's certainly strange to mourn somebody who's been dead for years, though. Yeah, that is pretty strange, Ash agreed with a chuckle. I just hope wherever Talico is, he's happy. Ember moved over to assist the still weak Cedric as he struggled to fill his plate. For a time, thoughts of mourning Talico drifted away, though his presence was not diminished. Ember almost imagined that Talico was close by, watching her with a warm smile on his incorporeal face. As dinner finished up, Cathy and Sage went into the kitchen to prepare dessert. Ember noticed Ash slip out of the door on her own. She finished up her conversation with Cedric, squeezed his shoulder, and moved to follow Ash. She nearly bumped into her sister as Ash returned to the tavern. Ember awkwardly moved aside so Ash could enter. Where did you get off to? Ember asked. Dessert's about to start. I had to get something out of the truck, Ash replied. She reached into a paper bag and extracted a wallet-sized wrapped present. Here, I thought maybe I should give you your wedding present early. Oh? Ember arched an eyebrow. Why is that? Why don't you open it and see? Ash asked, a knowing grin creasing her face. Ember chuckled and unwrapped the gift, her fingers shredding the thin tissue paper. She fully exposed the white cardboard box within. Yes, just what I've always wanted, a white cardboard box. Open it up, smart mouth, Ash said with an exasperated sigh. Ember chuckled and opened the box. She gaped at the beautiful beaded charm bracelet inside. When she reached in to pluck up the jewelry, Ember's fingers tingled. It's a protective charm, Ash said sweetly. I figured you being you, it'll probably come in handy before tomorrow. I can't say that it won't, Ember replied, slipping the bracelet on. She embraced Ash warmly and sighed. Thank you, sis. It looks good on you, Ash gasped. Oh no, we still need something treasured to help restore our parents' memory, and we don't have Talico to go deep sea diving any longer. Ember grinned. I have some thoughts on that, actually. She bent forward and told Ash her plan. Chapter 29. Ember stood in front of the mirror, struggling to control her throbbing heartbeat. So many feelings roiled inside her body. It was her wedding day at last, raising elation to dance like butterflies in her belly. Yet she also felt trepidation over the impending visit from her and Ash's parents. Would they be able to restore their memories of Ash? She hoped her plan worked. Ember stared at herself in the mirror, unable to believe the beautiful bride reflected back was her. Ember's long dark hair had been drawn back in thin brands sweeping back over her temples to knot together at the back of her head. The rest of her tresses descended in a curly silken wave, stopping just at the curve of her spine. Her makeup had been expertly applied at the salon. Ember approved of the toned-down look. It complemented her sleek white wedding dress well. The dress boasted translucent lace sleeves and an embroidered ivy pattern atop the white silk. Her charm bracelet glinted proudly on her wrist, making her think of Ash. A knock came at Ember's door. She moved to answer it, pursing her lips in worry. This was it, a moment 17 years in the making. Ember opened the door and smiled at her parents. Her mother's face spread into a wide smile of uncontained joy as she beheld Ember. Oh my goodness, you're so beautiful, her mother raved. Hi, Mom, Dad, Ember said with a smile, feeling a bit self-conscious. How are you doing? Doing? I'm a nervous wreck, her mother said. It's my only daughter's wedding day. How am I supposed to feel? Ember winced at the mention of being their only daughter, but didn't interrupt. Now was not the time. And I'm the father of the bride, her dad said gruffly. My job has been to hold my wallet open and keep my mouth shut, so I'm ecstatic that it's all over but the crying. Dear, her mother said firmly, tell your daughter she looks lovely. Her father had the good grace to look abashed. Sorry. You look lovely and radiant, Ember. Cedric is a lucky man. I'm a lucky woman, Ember corrected. So why did you want to see us specifically in here before the wedding? Her mother asked. I mean, we could have mingled somewhere else. Actually, about that, Ember began. The door opened and Ash entered. Her eyes widened when she saw their parents, an aching, longing urge burning deep in their depths. Their parents didn't have so much as a flicker of recognition for their long-missing daughter. Who's this? Ember's father asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. She seems kind of familiar. Ember and Ash looked to him hopefully. That's it, their father said, snapping his fingers. You used to wait tables at the Stuckies on the outskirts of town. Ash's shoulders slumped. Ember sighed and shook her head. No, Dad, she said. She's not a waitress. Then who is she? Their mother asked, moving her careworn gaze back and forth between her two daughters, only one of which she recognized. Ember fidgeted, pursing her lips. Well, Ember spoke in a rush. She's your daughter Ash, who you don't remember thanks to a magical curse. Their parents stared blankly at Ember, then turned their gazes to Ash. That's impossible, her father said with a chortle. Don't be ridiculous. Ember, her mother said, how could I possibly forget having given birth to another child? You're not making sense. Ember turned about and opened a small wooden jewelry box. She carefully extracted a heart-shaped locket. Ember stared at the golden locket as it dangled at the end of its chain. Would it really work? Mom, Dad, she said, turning back around. This picture was taken a little over 17 years ago. Ember opened the locket, revealing a photo of Ash, Ember, and their parents smiling happily together. She held it out for her parents' inspection. Incredible, her father murmured, staring at the picture in wonder. I can't believe it's true, her mother said. She stared intently at the photo, then turned her gaze on Ash. Their mother moved over to Ash, eyes scanning fitfully all over her features. She reached out and touched Ash's face. Ash's eyes fluttered closed and a tear escaped down her cheek. I can see it, their mother murmured. She turned about and faced her husband. I can see it. This is our daughter. There's no question of it now. If she really is our daughter, then what happens now? Ember's father turned his anxious gaze her way. What can we do about this? We have a spell, Ember said, looking over to Ash and exchanging nods with her. We think if we perform a ritual, we might be able to restore your memories. Their parents exchanged glances. Then they turned toward Ember and nodded. What do you want us to do? Ash and Ember drew chairs out into the center of the room. Ember hadn't expected to cast spells in her wedding dress, but it seemed oddly appropriate. She was starting a new life with Cedric, and restoring an old one with her sister. She and Ash chanted the spell, summoning their magical energies. The locket swung like a metronome. A light wind kicked up and stirred their parents' hair and clothing. Ash and Ember's chanting reached a crescendo as they built up the magic and allowed it to release. The wind died down. Ash stepped before her parents, face writ large with cautious hope. Mom, she said softly. Dad? Ashley? Their mother said, cupping her hands around Ash's cheeks. I remember you. I remember everything. Ash, her father sputtered, wiping away a tear. Ember squealed with delight and joined the group hug, feeling elation warm her heart. Finally, after so many long years, her family was whole again. A knock came at the door. Sage opened it up, her hair done up in an elaborate braid. Her painted lips parted in a smile as she singled Ember out with her gaze. It's time. Chapter 30. Ember's heart fluttered as she stepped toward the door, her arm entwined with her father's. Nearby, her sister and mother still embraced, swaying slightly and speaking in low tones. "Well, this is it," her father said with a sigh. "The day I lose my daughter forever. Seems appropriate. I gained a daughter today, and I lost one." "Oh, Dad, stop being so dramatic," Ember said, patting his arm. "You're not losing a daughter. You're gaining a son-in-law." "I know," her father said with a light chuckle. He turned a happy smile on her and sighed. "You look so beautiful, even more beautiful than your mother did on our wedding day." "Don't tell her I said that." Ember chuckled softly. Here comes the bride wafted over the tavern's loudspeakers, and they stepped out for their march. Ember stared down the double row of chairs arranged on the tavern's polished timbers. Red ribbons flanked their path. Lit candles burned merrily on elegantly carved sconces. Colorful streamers hung from the ceiling, placed there by Luca herself. Her gaze swept up the red carpet she and her father marched upon to settle upon Cedric. Ember's mouth fell open. Her eyes glazed over dreamily as she gazed at her soon-to-be husband. Cedric's hair had been styled, framing his handsome face and warm blue eyes. His tailored tuxedo accentuated his broad shoulders and long limbs. Cedric beamed a smile at her, his joy barely contained. She smiled back, a blush coming to her cheeks. She thought of their upcoming vows, and of their wedding night. As she swept down the aisle, she spotted many familiar faces. All of them smiled at her with shared joy at her happiest of days. Luca the fairy was present, of course, blowing on a tiny handkerchief as she cried happily. Cathy sat next to the sprite, waving enthusiastically and bouncing up and down in her seat. Randy Ryan smiled as she passed, mouthing the words, "Thank you for having cleared his name of murder." Lindsay Perez smiled happily, her cheeks wet from recent waterworks. Ember smiled back as she passed, then turned her gaze up to the altar. Ash, her maid of honor, looked lovely in a teal-green sheath dress. Ember had been so distracted by watching the gallery of witnesses she hadn't seen Ash take her place. Sage blew noisily on a handkerchief as Ember passed. They shared a wistful smile before Ember and her father ascended the shallow, elegant steps to the altar. Her father released her arm, kissing Ember on the cheek. He nodded at Cedric and then took his place to the side. As the pastor spoke, Ember couldn't hear anything other than the beating of her own heart. She took Cedric's hands and gazed into his lovely lupine eyes. She could remember the first time they'd met, the first case they'd worked together, the first time they'd kissed, the time he'd asked her to marry him. "Do you, Ember McNair, take this man, Cedric Jameson, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, to love, honor, and cherish, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," she said, her heart fluttering in her breast. "And do you, Cedric Jameson, take this woman, Ember McNair, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, to love, honor, and cherish, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," he said. "Then I now pronounce you man and wife," the pastor said with a grin. "You may kiss the bride." Cedric took her in his arms and pressed his lips tenderly against her own. Ember's heart swelled with joy, and the wedding guests applauded warmly. They walked down the steps hand in hand. Ember smiled at Cedric as they swept down the aisle to a standing ovation from all their family and friends. The doors swung open before them and they paused on the steps. Single women gathered below the stairs, including Ash and Sage. Ember turned her back to the women and gripped the bouquet in her hands tightly. She winked at Cedric and muttered a short spell as she tossed the bouquet. It unerringly diverted through the air right into Ash's waiting grasp. "Oh, hell no!" Ash snapped, shoving the bouquet firmly into Sage's hands. "Here, these look better on you." "You can't do that," Sage said. "I just did," Ash replied. Their voices faded as Cedric and Ember entered his car. Cans and streamers bounced along the road behind them as they made their way to the reception. "I love you, Mrs. Ember Jennings," Cedric said. "I love you, my dear husband," she replied. They drove off into the sunset together,